Abigail Carter's hands were shaking so hard, she nearly dropped the rope before she'd even reached the stall door, and behind her, 12 grown men were laughing loud enough to spook the chickens clear across the yard. She didn't turn around. She didn't wipe the tears drying salty on her cheeks from her father's burial that morning. She just gripped the splintered wood of Titan's gate, looked into the black stallion's wild rolling eye, and whispered the only thing she had left in this world. I ain't scared of you. I'm scared of everything else. Before this story goes any further, if stories like this, one of broken women and broken horses, finding their way back to whole mean something to you, hit that subscribe button right now, because this tale is going to take you somewhere you won't forget, and I want you along for every mile of it. Drop the name of the town you're watching from down in the comments, so I can see just how far this story has traveled, and know you're riding along with Abigail all the way to the end. Redstone, Wyoming. In the summer of 1888 was not a forgiving place, and Abigail Carter had learned that the hard way 3 days running. First, she'd watched the fever take her father in a room that smelled of camphor and defeat. Then, she'd watched the undertaker nail his pine box shut before she'd even finished saying goodbye, because the man wanted his money and didn't care much for grief getting in the way of business. And now, walking the last 4 miles into Redstone with everything she owned wrapped in a flour sack over her shoulder, she was about to be laughed at by a yard full of ranch hands who hadn't yet learned her name. "You lost, miss!" One of them called out a wiry fellow with tobacco-stained teeth, and the others chuckled like he'd said something clever. Abigail didn't answer him. She kept walking toward the big man standing near the barn door with his arms crossed, and his hat pulled low because something about the way he held himself told her he was the one who mattered here. "I'm looking for Nathan Brooks," she said. "You found him? I hear you got a horse nobody can ride." The laughter behind her cut off sharp, like somebody had slammed a door on it. Nathan Brooks turned his head slow, and Abigail saw the scar, then a thin white line running from his temple down past his jaw, the kind of scar that told a story a man didn't want to tell twice. "Who told you that?" "Folks in town. Said there's a stallion out here killed a man's career and near killed the man himself. Said 12 trainers tried, and 12 trainers failed." She swallowed. "I want to be the 13th. Nathan looked her over the way a man looks over a mule he's thinking about not buying. Thin arms, torn hem on her dress, boots that had walked more miles than they had years left in them. "You ever broke a horse before?" "I never broke one," Abigail said. "I've gentled plenty. That ain't the same thing?" "No, sir, it ain't. That's why I'm here and not somewhere else." One of the hands, a heavy-set man named Bull, spat in the dirt and grinned. "Boss, we got real trainers coming up from Cheyenne next month. Ain't no sense letting some girl get herself stomped for nothing." "I can hear him," Abigail said, still looking at Nathan. "And I ain't asking permission to try. I'm asking for a chance. There's a difference." Something flickered behind Nathan's eyes quick as a match catching and going out. He didn't smile. Abigail would learn later that Nathan Brooks didn't smile easy, not since Titan had thrown him headfirst into a stone wall and left him with more than a scar. But something in his face softened, just enough that she knew he was actually considering it. "You got a name." "Abigail Carter." "Carter." Nathan's brow pulled tight. "Any relation to Wendell Carter out past Laramie?" "He was my father." Her voice caught on the word "was," and she hated herself for it, hated that grief could still reach up and grab her by the throat in front of strangers. "We buried him this morning." The yard went quiet. Even Bull had the decency to look at his boots. "Wendell Carter," Nathan said again, softer this time, like he was turning the name over and finding something valuable underneath it. "Man had a gift with horses, best I ever heard of. Folks used to say he could talk a horse out of its own fear." "He could," Abigail said. "He taught me everything he knew before the fever took him, every bit of it, and I got nothing left now except what's in this sack and what's in my head, and I aim to use both." Nathan studied her a long moment, and Abigail made herself stand still under it. Made herself not flinch, because she'd learned a long time ago that showing weakness to a man sizing you up was the same as handing him a knife. "Come with me," Nathan finally said. He led her past the bunkhouse, past the corral, where two geldings grazed lazy in the afternoon sun, all the way to the last stall in the barn, set apart from the others by a second fence. Nathan had built himself thick oak rails reinforced with iron. Even from 20 feet away, Abigail could hear it, the low rumble of breath, the shift of hooves against packed earth, a sound like something coiled and waiting. "That's Titan," Nathan said, and his voice had changed, gone tight and careful. "Best bloodline in the territory, sired by a stallion my father brought over from Kentucky. Should have been the foundation of the finest breeding program this side of the Mississippi." Should have been. 4 years ago something happened to him. I don't rightly know what. Storm spooked him bad, near burned the barn down, and he ain't been right since. 12 trainers. Nathan held up a hand, fingers spread. 12. Best men money could buy come up from Cheyenne down from Montana. One's got a limp now he'll carry to his grave. One won't get on a horse again as long as he lives. And you. Nathan's jaw tightened. And me. That scar. Ain't your business. No, sir, it ain't. Abigail stepped past him toward the fence, and Nathan's hand shot out to grab her arm. "You get within reach of that horse, and he will kill you, Miss Carter. I have seen what he does to men twice your size." "Then let go of my arm," Abigail said, quiet and even, "because holding on to me ain't gonna stop what I came here to do." Nathan let go. Abigail walked to the fence close enough now that she could see Titan properly. 17 hands of solid black muscle, a white blaze down his nose like a crack of lightning. Eyes rolled back just enough to show the white ears pinned flat. He was magnificent. He was also, Abigail understood immediately, absolutely terrified. She didn't reach for him. She didn't say a word to him yet. She just stood there, hands loose at her sides, breathing slow and even the way her father had taught her, before he'd taught her anything else. "A horse don't hear your words first," he used to say. "He hears your heartbeat. You want him calm, you get calm first. Ain't no other way in." Behind her, Bull snorted. "She's just standing there. Let her be," Nathan said, but his voice carried no real conviction, like a man who expected disappointment and was only waiting for it to arrive on schedule. Abigail stood at that fence for the better part of an hour, while the sun dropped lower and the ranch hands drifted off one by one, bored of watching a woman do nothing. Titan's ears came up, once swiveled toward her, then pinned back again. His breathing slowed just a fraction before something spooked him. A dropped bucket somewhere across the yard, and he reared back against the far wall of his stall, striking it hard enough that the whole barn shook. Abigail didn't jump. She didn't run. She stayed exactly where she was, and when the dust settled and Titan stood there trembling, nostrils flared, she said the first word she'd say to him. "I know." That was all. 2 words. But something in the stallion's body shifted some fraction of tension, letting go, like he'd been braced for a whip that never came. "You know what?" Nathan asked. He'd come back, was standing a few feet behind her now, arms crossed again, but his weight shifted forward, curious despite himself. "I know what it's like to have your whole world burn down around you and have folks expect you to just get up the next morning like nothing happened." Abigail didn't take her eyes off the horse. "I buried my father this morning, Mr. Brooks. Tomorrow I got to figure out how I'm gonna eat. Ain't nobody asking if I'm all right. Ain't nobody got time for that. World just keeps moving, and you're supposed to move with it or get left behind." She nodded slow toward Titan. "He's not crazy. He's not evil. He's just scared, and scared animals do desperate things, same as scared people." Nathan was quiet a long moment. "The bank's been sniffing around this ranch for 2 years, Miss Carter. My father built this place with his bare hands, and I have run it into the ground trying to fix a horse that don't want fixing. I got maybe 6 months before they take it, all the land, the herd, everything my daddy ever worked for. I don't need a philosopher. I need a miracle." "I ain't a miracle worker." Abigail finally turned to face him. "But I'm the only person who's walked through that gate in 4 years and didn't come at him with a whip or a chain or a rope meant to choke him into submission. That's gotta count for something. And if you fail, then I fail, same as everybody else." "No." Nathan's voice went hard, and something raw moved behind his eyes. Not cruelty, Abigail realized, but fear. The particular fear of a man who'd already lost too much to lose anything else carelessly. If you fail, you walk away before that horse decides for you. You understand me. I have buried enough of my own mistakes on this ranch. I will not bury a cart or two. Fair enough, Abigail said. But I need somewhere to sleep and something to eat while I work, because I got exactly $11 to my name, and most of that's spoken for already. Nathan studied her another long moment, and Abigail watched him do the arithmetic a desperate man does when he's got nothing left to lose, and one thin thread of hope dangling in front of him. There's a room off the tack shed. Ain't much. Roof don't leak mostly. I've slept in worse. I don't doubt it. Nathan finally for the first time almost smiled, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth gone as quick as it came. You got 30 days, Miss Carter. Bank examiners coming at the end of the month to assess the herd, and if that horse is still tearing his stall apart when he does, there ain't gonna be a Red Hawk ranch left for either one of us to worry about. 30 days. 30 days. Abigail looked past Nathan one more time back at Titan, who stood watching her now, with his ears no longer pinned flat, but turned halfway toward her, listening, uncertain, waiting to see what kind of creature this new one would turn out to be. All right, she said. 30 days. That first night, lying on a cot in the tack shed with the smell of leather and hay thick around her and her father's old rope coiled beneath her pillow like a talisman, Abigail didn't sleep much. She kept hearing Titan's hooves against the stall wall somewhere across the yard. That restless, furious rhythm, and underneath it quieter, she kept hearing her father's voice. A horse that's been hurt bad enough will tell you everything about himself if you're patient enough to listen. Trouble is, most folks ain't got the patience. They want the horse fixed by Tuesday. She had 30 days. Not much more patience than most folks if she was honest with herself. But she had something else. Most trainers who'd come through here didn't have. She had nothing left to lose, and a body that had already learned how to keep standing after everything worth standing for had been taken away. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Abigail was back at the fence. She didn't bring a rope. She didn't bring a whip. She brought a low stool, and she set it down 8 feet from the rail, and she sat. Bull found her there an hour later, hauling a bucket of feed toward the other stalls. He stopped and stared, like she'd grown a second head. You just gonna sit there? I'm gonna sit here every morning until he stops looking at me like I'm fixing to hurt him. Abigail said, not turning around. However long that takes. Boss give you 30 days. You're gonna spend 'em sitting on a stool. I'm gonna spend the first few earning trust because trust is the only thing that horse has ever been robbed of, and you can't force somebody to give you back what was stolen from them. You gotta wait for them to hand it over. Bull shook his head and walked on, muttering something about crazy women, but Abigail barely heard him. She was watching Titan, who had stopped his pacing and stood now in the far corner of his stall, one ear turned toward her, watching back. I know you don't trust me yet, she said softly, not moving from the stool. I don't blame you one bit. Every single person who's ever walked up to that fence wanted something from you. Wanted to break you down till you did what they said. I ain't here for that. She let the silence sit a moment, let the morning settle around them both. I'm here because I got nowhere else to be, and you got nobody else who's gonna sit still long enough to listen. Way I see it, that makes us about even. Titan's ears flicked once toward the sound of her voice and stayed there. It wasn't trust. Not yet. It was something smaller, something that hadn't existed in that stall for 4 long years. The first thin, fragile thread of curiosity, the beginning of a question the horse didn't yet have words for. Though if he had, it might have sounded something like, "Who are you, and why aren't you afraid of me?" Abigail didn't know yet how many mornings it would take to answer that question. She didn't know about Silas Granger sharpening his knives 3 miles east, waiting for Red Hawk Ranch to fall so he could pick the bones clean. She didn't know that the man standing behind her, arms crossed jaw tight, was slowly beginning to hope again for the first time in 4 years. And that hope, once it took root in a man like Nathan Brooks, was a dangerous and beautiful thing to watch grow. All she knew sitting on that stool in the cold morning light with grief still raw in her chest and $11 to her name was that somewhere behind those iron-reinforced rails stood a creature as broken and as stubborn and as determined to survive as she was. And for the first time since she'd buried her father, Abigail, Carter felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was standing right next to it waiting its turn. 3 mornings became 5, and 5 became 8, and Abigail Carter had not once tried to touch Titan. Bull had taken to calling her the sitting woman behind her back, though not so far behind that she didn't hear it. She let it pass. Her father had told her once that a man's mockery was just fear wearing a smaller coat, and she believed him because she'd seen enough scared men in her 24 years to recognize the pattern. On the 9th morning, something changed. Abigail set her stool down at its usual 8 feet, and before she'd even settled onto it, Titan's head came up and turned toward her, not with the wild rolling panic of that first day, but with something quieter. Recognition. "Morning," she said. The stallion didn't flinch. He didn't pin his ears. He stood there watching her settle onto the stool, and for the first time, he didn't retreat to the far corner of his stall. Nathan Brooks had come to stand at the barn door, coffee cup forgotten in his hand, and he was watching too. "He knows your voice now," he said quietly. "Took him long enough." Abigail didn't take her eyes off the horse. 9 days for him to learn I ain't going anywhere. My father used to say a horse's memory for kindness is exactly as long as his memory for cruelty. Only difference is kindness has to prove itself over and over before he'll believe it. Cruelty, he only needs to feel once. That why the 12 before you never got this far. That, and every one of them walked in here wanting something from him on their own timeline. Wanted him saddle broke by Friday so they could collect their pay and move on to the next ranch. Abigail shifted slightly on the stool, slow, unthreatening. "I ain't in a hurry, Mr. Brooks." "Well, I am. Bank examiners coming in 3 weeks and change, and I know that clock's ticking same as you do. But Titan don't know what a calendar is. You rush him, you lose him. Simple as that." Nathan's jaw tightened at the mention of the examiner, and Abigail saw something pass behind his eyes. Worry plain and heavy, the kind a man carried around like a stone in his boot every waking hour. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks and 2 days if we're counting. We're counting. He didn't answer that. He just stood there a moment longer, watching the horse watch the woman, and then he turned and walked back toward the house, his shoulders set in a way that told Abigail he was carrying more than just worry about a horse. She found out what later that same afternoon when she walked to the well for water and heard raised voices coming from around the side of the barn. "Ain't your land to be selling opinions about Granger, and you know it." That was Nathan's voice, tight and low, the voice of a man holding his temper by a thread. "I ain't selling opinions, Brooks. I'm stating facts. Your daddy's survey from 71 don't match the county's resurvey from 79. Now maybe that's an honest mistake. Maybe it ain't. But either way, that's 200 acres of grazing land sitting in a gray area. And gray areas got a way of getting resolved in court. Court costs money. You got money." Abigail set her bucket down slow and quiet and moved close enough to the corner of the barn to see without being seen. The man talking to Nathan was tall and narrow-dressed, sharper than any rancher had business dressing, with a thin mustache that looked like it had been trimmed with a ruler. "You've been circling this ranch for 2 years, Silas," Nathan said. "Everybody in Redstone knows it. You want the water rights on the north pasture, and you always have." "I want what's fair," Silas said, smiling in a way that made the word fair sound like a threat. "And I hear you got yourself a little project going on in that back barn. Some girl trying to gentle that killer horse of yours." He clicked his tongue slow and mocking. "Whole town's talking about it, Nathan. Talking about how a grieving man's letting some stranger woman live out here alone with him. No chaperone, no propriety. Folks got opinions about that kind of thing. Folks can keep their opinions to themselves. Folks don't work that way, and you know it." Silas's voice dropped, took on an oily sweetness that made Abigail's skin crawl even from a distance. "I'm just saying a man in your position bank sniffing around land dispute hanging over your head, and now rumors flying about impropriety on top of it. That's an awful lot of trouble for one ranch to carry. Might be easier just to sell. I'd give you a fair price. Save you the embarrassment. Get off my land, Silas. It's a public road, Nathan. I got every right to stand on it. Silas tipped his hat, slow and deliberate mockery dressed up as manners. You think on my offer. Clock's ticking faster than you know. Abigail stayed pressed against the barn wall until she heard Silas's horse trot away down the road, and then she stepped out, bucket forgotten, and found Nathan standing exactly where Silas had left him, staring at nothing. How much of that did you hear? He asked without turning around. Enough. Then you understand why I need that horse ready in 3 weeks. It ain't just about breeding stock anymore. He finally turned to face her, and the lines around his eyes looked deeper than they had that morning. If the bank sees Titans still unmanageable, they call the loan. If they call the loan, I can't fight Silas's land claim in court, because I won't have 2 nickels to rub together for a lawyer. And if I lose that fight, this ranch, everything my father built, belongs to a man who wants it for nothing but the water underneath it. And the rumors. Nathan's face colored slightly. That's nonsense. You're my employee. There ain't nothing improper. I know that. You know that. Don't matter to men like Silas Granger what's true. Only matters what's useful. Abigail picked her bucket back up, steadying her voice, steadying herself. Best thing we can do about rumors is give the town something else to talk about. Something they can't twist into gossip. Like what? Like a horse that used to throw grown men into stone walls, walking calm as a lamb through the middle of Redstone. Nathan almost laughed a short, disbelieving huff of air. That horse won't even take a saddle blanket yet. Not yet, Abigail agreed. Give me time. That night, lying on her cot with her father's rope coiled beneath her pillow, Abigail allowed herself for just a few minutes to feel the full weight of what she'd walked into. It wasn't just a horse anymore. It was a ranch, a man's whole legacy, and now apparently her own reputation tangled up in gossip she hadn't asked for and couldn't control. She thought about walking away, thought about it seriously, the way a tired person considers laying down a heavy load, and then she thought about her father, about the debt he'd left behind, about the $11 dwindling toward nothing in her boot. She thought about Titan's ears turning toward her voice that morning. She stayed. The next week brought the first real breakthrough, and it came on a morning nobody expected. Abigail had progressed from sitting outside the stall to standing near the rail, and from standing near the rail to reaching one open palm, slowly through the slats, letting it hover in the air, patient, unmoving, asking nothing. For 3 days, Titan had ignored the hand entirely, or flinched away from it with a snort of warning. On the 4th day, he took one step closer. On the 5th, he lowered his great head and breathed against her palm, one long, warm exhale, his nostrils flaring against her skin, and then he startled at his own boldness and jerked backward, nearly rearing. Abigail didn't move, didn't gasp, didn't retreat her hand. That's it, she murmured. That's all it was. Just breath. Nothing to run from. Bull had been watching from across the yard, and this time he didn't call out anything mocking. He just stood there, arms slack at his sides, mouth slightly open. Boss ought to see this, he muttered, and went to fetch Nathan. By the time Nathan arrived breathless from crossing the yard too fast, Titan had already come back to the rail on his own, without Abigail's coaxing, and lowered his head to breathe against her hand a second time. He's never done that, Nathan said, voice hushed like he was in church. Not once. Not with any of them. He's never had anybody wait long enough for him to decide to trust him, Abigail said, not taking her eyes off the horse. That's the whole secret, Mr. Brooks. There ain't no trick to it. Just time and patience, and never once lying to him about what you want. What do you want? Abigail considered the question a moment. Right now, I just want him to know I ain't going anywhere he don't invite me. That evening, for the first time since she'd arrived, Nathan invited her to eat supper at the main table, instead of alone in the tack shed. It was a small thing, beans, cornbread, coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the stove, but Abigail understood the weight of it. A man like Nathan Brooks didn't share his table lightly. Your father, Nathan said halfway through the meal, not quite looking at her. Wendell Carter, I only met him the once years back, but I remember thinking he had a way of looking at a horse like he already knew its whole story before it told him. That's about right. Abigail turned her coffee cup slow between her hands. He used to say, every horse that acts up has got a reason, and the reason's always fear dressed up as meanness. Folks just see the meanness and never bother looking underneath it. He raised you alone. Since I was 9. My mother passed of the same fever that took him years apart, like it was waiting patient for both of them. She said it plain without asking for pity, and Nathan seemed to understand that and didn't offer any. We moved from ranch to ranch most of my life. He'd hire on wherever they needed a horse gentled, and I'd tag along and learn everything he knew, and then we'd move on to the next place. Never had much, never needed much, long as we had each other and a horse worth understanding. Sounds lonely. Sounds like most everybody's life one way or another. Abigail met his eyes, then steady. You'd know something about that yourself, I expect. Nathan's hand went briefly to the scar along his jaw, an old habit he probably didn't even notice himself doing. This ranch used to be full of noise. My father, my mother before they passed. Hands laughing in the bunkhouse of an evening. Now it's just quiet. Too quiet most days. Titan's part of that quiet, ain't he? Not just the money he represents, the company he used to be before the fever or the storm or whatever it was that broke him. Nathan looked at her a long moment, surprised, like she'd reached into a locked drawer he hadn't shown anybody the key to. He used to follow me around the pasture like a dog, he said, finally quiet. My father used to joke he loved that horse more than he loved most people. And then the storm hit and the barn near burned, and by the time I got him out, something in him had just gone. Wouldn't let me near him. Wouldn't let anybody near him. I tried for the better part of a year before I gave up and started hiring trainers instead. He shook his head slow. I told myself I gave up because I didn't have the skill for it. Truth is, I think I gave up because it hurt too much, trying and failing with an animal that used to trust me like nothing else on this earth. That ain't giving up, Abigail said. That's grief. Different thing entirely. Something passed between them, then quiet and unspoken, the particular understanding of two people who had both buried something and kept walking anyway. The moment didn't last. A shout from the yard broke it, one of the hands hollering that a rider was coming up the road fast, and Nathan was on his feet before the words had finished, hand going instinctively toward the rifle propped by the door. It wasn't Silas Granger. It was worse in its way, a thin, nervous young man in a bank clerk's suit hat pushed back horse-lathered from hard riding. Mr. Brooks, the young man called, sliding off his horse before it had fully stopped. Mr. Brooks, I've got news, and I figured you'd rather hear it from me direct than read it in a letter. Spit it out, Charlie. The banks moved the assessment date up. Examiners coming in 10 days, not 3 weeks. Charlie swallowed hard, clearly hating being the bearer of it. I overheard Mr. Granger talking to the bank president yesterday. He's the one who requested it moved up. Said something about wanting the matter settled before the situation deteriorates further. Whatever that means. Nathan went very still. 10 days, he said. Yes, sir. Abigail felt the floor tilt slightly under her. The whole careful architecture of her plan, weeks of slow, patient trust building, suddenly cut down to a fraction of the time she'd counted on. 10 days, Nathan said again, and turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw not blame, not yet, but something close to despair, trying hard not to show itself. 10 days is enough, Abigail said with far more confidence than she felt. Miss Carter, that horse won't even wear a saddle blanket. He will, Abigail said, because he has to, and because I'm not going to let Silas Granger win by scaring us into rushing something that don't need rushing. 10 days is enough time to do this right, so long as nobody panics between now and then. She looked at Charlie. Thank you for riding out to tell us. Course, ma'am. Charlie tipped his hat, clearly relieved to have discharged his duty without being shot as the messenger, and mounted back up. I hope it works out, Mr. Brooks. I truly do. My father always said your daddy ran the finest operation in the county. He rode off, and the yard fell quiet again. quiet in the way it does right before something important happens, and Nathan turned to Abigail with his jaw set hard. 10 days, he said a third time, like saying it enough might change the number. Then we'd best not waste the daylight we got left today, Abigail said, and walked back toward the barn. That night she didn't sleep at all. She sat outside Titan's stall by lantern light long after the rest of the ranch had gone dark, talking to him low and steady about nothing in particular, her childhood, her father's old sayings, the taste of the first good meal she'd had in weeks. Not because the words mattered, but because the sound of a calm voice hour after hour was its own kind of medicine. Somewhere past midnight, Titan lay down in his stall for the first time since she'd arrived, folding his great legs beneath him with a heaviness that spoke of exhaustion finally overtaking fear. Abigail wept quiet, watching him sleep. She wasn't entirely sure if the tears were for the horse, or for her father, or for the 10 days now standing between her and everything she was trying to save. The next morning she made her first real request of Nathan. "I need the saddle blanket, not to put on him yet, just to leave near the stall, let him get used to the smell of it, the sight of it, before I ever bring it close." 10 days, Miss Carter? I know how many days we got, Mr. Brooks. I'm counting same as you. She kept her voice even though inside the clock was screaming at her, same as it was screaming at him. But rushing him now undoes everything we built these past 2 weeks. You want it done fast, or you want it done right. Because fast and right ain't the same road here, and I only know how to walk the one. Nathan exhaled long and slow, and finally nodded. Right then. God help us. The blanket sat folded on a barrel outside the stall for 2 full days, before Abigail so much as touched it in front of the horse. On the 3rd day, she draped it over her own shoulders and walked close to the rail. Let Titan smell it on her. Let him understand the blanket and the woman he'd learned to trust were now somehow the same thing. He flinched. He backed away. But he didn't bolt, and by evening he'd returned to the rail on his own, nosing curiously at the fabric still draped over her shoulders. "Good boy," she whispered. Good boy." Word of the progress spread through the ranch hands faster than Abigail expected, and with it came a shift in how they looked at her. Not the open mockery of that first day, but something more grudging, more careful. Bull, in particular, took to lingering near the barn during her morning sessions, no longer laughing, watching instead, with the quiet attention of a man revising an opinion he'd been proud of holding. "How'd you learn all this?" he asked her one morning gruff, like the question cost him something to ask. "My father." "Your father teach you how to handle the mouths that come with it, too? The talk in town?" Abigail's hand stilled on the rail. "What talk?" Bull looked uncomfortable, shifted his weight. "Ain't my business to repeat it." "Bull," he sighed. "Folks in Redstone saying things. About you living out here. About you and the boss." He said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "Silas Granger's been buying drinks at the saloon from what I hear, and every round comes with a story attached. Ain't nothing you're doing wrong, Miss Carter. I want you to know I don't believe a word of it. But folks talk, and talk's got a way of turning into trouble if it goes on long enough." Abigail felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not for herself, she'd weathered worse than gossip in her 24 years, but for what it might mean for Nathan, for the fragile progress she'd made for the ranch itself, hanging by threads that seemed to multiply by the day. She said nothing about it to Nathan that day or the next. There wasn't time to spare on a problem she couldn't solve with patience and a rope. But it sat with her low and persistent while she worked. The saddle came next, and it came harder than the blanket had. Titan accepted the sight of it eventually sitting on the barrel, same as the blanket had. He accepted eventually the smell of the leather worked and oiled familiar in a way that seemed to stir something old and buried in him. But the first time Abigail lifted it toward his back, slow, careful murmuring, the whole time he reared so violently that the whole stall shuddered, and Abigail had to throw herself backward against the rail to avoid a flailing hoof. "Miss Carter." Nathan was there in an instant, hauling her back from the stall by the shoulders, his face gone white. "You could have been killed?" "I'm fine." Her heart was hammering, hands trembling, but she kept her voice level. He's not ready for the saddle yet. That's all this means. Not that he'll never be ready. Just not yet. We got 7 days left, Miss Carter. 7. I know the number, Nathan. She hadn't meant to use his first name. It slipped out in the adrenaline of the moment, and she saw him notice. It saw something shift in his expression, though neither of them commented on it. I know the number same as you do, but if I push him into that saddle before he's ready, he won't just refuse it. He'll associate the saddle with fear all over again, and every bit of progress we made with the blanket gets undone in a single afternoon. You want to gamble 7 days on that? Nathan's hands were still gripping her shoulders, she realized, and he seemed to realize it at the same moment, releasing her quickly, stepping back with color rising in his face. No, he said quieter. No, I don't want to gamble anything, He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. I've watched this ranch slip through my fingers for 4 years, Miss Carter. Watched my father's whole life's work turn to dust because I couldn't fix one broken horse. I don't know how to watch that happen and stay calm about it. Then don't watch, Abigail said gentler now. Trust me instead. I know that's a hard thing to ask of a man who's had nothing but disappointment handed to him for years, but it's the only thing I know how to offer you. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, and then he nodded slow. All right, he said. I trust you. It was the first time he'd said those words to anyone in longer than he could remember, and both of them seemed to understand the weight of that, standing there in the barn, with dust motes catching the late afternoon light, and Titan's ragged breathing filling the silence between them. The next attempt with the saddle came 2 days later, and this time Abigail changed her approach entirely. Instead of lifting the saddle toward Titan's back directly, she spent the whole morning simply resting her forearm across his withers, letting him feel weight without fear, letting him understand that pressure didn't have to mean pain. By afternoon, he'd stopped flinching at her arm entirely, had even leaned slightly into the contact, the way a creature does when its finally decided touch might mean something other than danger. Only then did she try the saddle again, not lifted onto his back all at once, but eased on slow an inch at a time, pausing at every flicker of tension to retreat and try again. It took 4 hours. Nathan watched from the barn door the entire time, not moving, barely breathing, and when the saddle finally settled fully onto Titan's back, and the stallion merely shifted his weight and let out a long breath instead of exploding into panic, Nathan made a sound. Abigail hadn't heard from him before, something between a laugh and a sob, raw and unguarded. He did it, Nathan said. He actually did it. We did it, Abigail corrected, cinching the girth with careful, gentle hands, still murmuring low reassurances to the horse the whole while. This one's on both of us. That evening, for the first time, Nathan brought a bottle of good whiskey to the supper table, instead of coffee, and poured 2 small glasses, and raised his in a silent toast that Abigail understood without him needing to explain it. 6 days, he said. 6 days, she agreed, and they drank. But the celebration was short-lived. That very night, past midnight, Abigail woke to the sound of raised voices and hoofbeats in the yard, and by the time she'd pulled on her boots and run outside, she found Nathan standing in the moonlight with 2 of Silas Granger's men, a torch held between them, its light throwing long shadows across the barn wall. Last warning. Brooks, one of the men was saying, a big fellow with a scar of his own across one eyebrow. Mr. Granger says this ranch changes hands one way or another. Might as well be the easy way. Get off my land, Nathan said, and his voice carried none of the exhaustion Abigail had heard at supper. This was a different Nathan. Hard-edged, dangerous in a way she hadn't seen from him before. That land dispute's gonna go to court whether you like it or not, the second man said. Judge is a friend of Mr. Granger's. Might go easier on you if you sold now instead of fighting a losing battle. I said get off my land. The men exchanged a look, and for a moment Abigail thought there might be violence. She saw Nathan's hand drift toward his hip, saw the tension coil tight in the yard, but then the first man laughed low and mean and swung back up onto his horse. Have it your way, he said. Judge Whitfield's gonna enjoy hearing about the impropriety happening out here too. Unmarried woman living alone with you, no chaperone, Might color how he sees the whole dispute, don't you think? They rode off into the dark laughing, and Nathan stood there long after the hoofbeats had faded, fists clenched at his sides. "Nathan!" He turned, and in the moonlight Abigail could see the fury and the fear both written plain across his face. "They're going to use you against me," he said. "The gossip, the impropriety, Silas is going to feed it straight to a judge who already owes him favors, and it won't matter one bit that nothing's ever happened between us. It'll matter that it looks like it might have, and that'll be enough to turn opinion against this ranch when we need it most. Then we give them nothing to twist," Abigail said, steady, despite the cold knot forming in her chest. "I'll ask Mrs. Whitcomb from town to come stay in the house proper and respectable till this is settled. That takes the wind clean out of that particular sail. That doesn't fix the land dispute. No, but it's one less weapon in Silas Granger's hand, and right now we take every advantage we can get." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion carved deep into his face. "You didn't build this trouble, Nathan. Silas did, and greed did, and a storm 4 years back that broke a horse's spirit and near broke yours along with it. None of that is yours to carry alone anymore. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, not with 6 days left, or 600. Something in Nathan's face cracked open, then some wall he'd been holding steady since his father died, since the storm. Since 12 trainers had failed and left him believing he was cursed to lose everything he loved. "Why?" he asked, voice rough. "Why do you care this much about a stranger's ranch, a stranger's horse?" "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," Abigail said simply. "And I made up my mind a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stop somebody else from losing everything too, I'd take it. Every time, no matter the cost." They stood there a long moment in the dark yard, closer than propriety strictly allowed, and neither one moved away. 6 days, Nathan said finally, voice unsteady. 6 days, Abigail agreed. "Let's go make them count." The following morning brought the first mounted lesson, and it very nearly ended in disaster. Abigail approached it the same way she'd approached everything else, slow, deliberate, giving Titan every chance to refuse before ever asking him to accept. She stood beside him in the saddle for the better part of an hour, letting him feel her weight against his side without ever swinging a leg over, murmuring the whole time, waiting for the moment his ears would tell her he was ready. When she finally eased herself up into the saddle, Titan went rigid beneath her every muscle, locked, head high, eyes rolling, and for 3 long seconds Abigail was certain he was about to explode into the same violence that had crippled 12 men before her. "Easy," she breathed. "Easy now. I know. I know it's a lot to ask. I know." The stallion trembled beneath her, a long shudder running down his whole body, and then slowly, impossibly, he let out a breath and stood still. Nathan, watching from the fence, had gone entirely white, one hand gripping the rail so hard his knuckles showed. "He's letting you sit him," he said, disbelieving. "He's deciding whether to trust me with something he's never trusted anybody with since the storm," Abigail corrected softly, not moving a muscle, letting the horse set the pace of everything that happened next. "Don't rush him, Nathan, not even with your excitement. He can feel that too." She sat there motionless for nearly 20 minutes before she gave the faintest signal with her weight and her heels, the smallest possible ask, just 1 step forward. Titan's ears flicked back toward her, considering, and then, achingly slow, he took the step. Then another. Then another. By the end of that first session, Titan had walked the full length of the corral with Abigail on his back, calm as any well-broke ranch horse, and the entire yard had gone silent watching it happen. Bull in the other hands, and Nathan himself, all of them witnessing something they genuinely believed impossible. 4 years, Nathan said, his voice thick. 4 years and 12 men, and none of them ever got this far. None of them had 6 days of desperation on their side, neither, Abigail said, though she was smiling now, unable to keep it fully hidden. "Fear's a terrible teacher, but sometimes it's a mighty efficient one." But even as the words left her mouth, she caught sight of a rider approaching from the eastern road, moving fast, and something in the set of his shoulders told her this wasn't good news arriving. It was Charlie again, the young bank clerk, and his face when he pulled up was grimmer than it had been the first time. "Mr. Brooks," he said, breathless, "there's more. Mr. Granger filed papers this morning, formal ones, disputing your father's original survey. He's asking the court for an injunction, wants to stop any further, and I quote, improvements or investments on the disputed acreage until the matter's settled. And Judge Whitfield's agreed to hear it fast-tracked. 3 days from now." 3 days, Nathan repeated, and Abigail heard the particular flatness in his voice that came from a man who had simply run out of room to absorb any more bad news. "There's one more thing," Charlie said, hesitant, now glancing toward Abigail, almost apologetically. "Judge Whitfield's asking around about the living arrangements out here. Somebody's been feeding him talk. I don't know who." He clearly did know who, and clearly didn't want to say Silas Granger's name twice in one conversation. "Just thought you ought to know what you're walking into before the hearing." He rode off, and Nathan turned slowly to look at Abigail, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. 3 days, he finally said, for a legal hearing that could end this ranch on top of the bank examiner still coming in 6. And now a judge with poisoned opinions about propriety, thanks to a man who wants nothing but my water rights and my land. Then we've got 3 days to get Mrs. Whitcomb settled proper in that house," Abigail said, forcing steel into her voice, even as her stomach twisted with dread. "And 3 days to figure out how in God's name we prove that survey dispute is nothing but a fraud dressed up as a legal claim." "You know something about surveys, Miss Carter." "No," Abigail admitted. "But my father kept every scrap of paper he ever touched in 40 years of ranch work, out of habit, and among that mess. Back at our old place, there's a box of old county records he used to reference when he was settling grazing disputes for other outfits. I don't know if there's anything useful in there, but I know where it is, and I know it's worth a look before we run out of days to look." Nathan stared at her. "You'd ride 2 days each direction on top of everything else happening here on the chance there's something useful in an old box of papers." "I'd ride to the moon and back if it meant keeping Silas Granger from getting what he wants," Abigail said, and meant every word of it. That night, the ranch felt different. Charged urgent, everyone moving with the particular energy of people who understood exactly how much was riding on the days ahead. Abigail packed a small bag by lantern light, and Nathan found her in the tack shed, hovering awkward in the doorway, like a man who had something to say and didn't quite know how to start. "I could send one of the hands instead," he said. "You don't have to make that ride yourself. They wouldn't know what to look for. I would." Abigail cinched her bag closed. "Besides, Titan's made more progress with me than anybody. 2 days away won't set us back too far. Not now, but a stranger trying to keep his progress steady while I'm gone might undo weeks of work in an afternoon. Best I go and go fast and get back before he even has time to miss me." "Will he miss you, I mean?" Abigail looked up at him, caught something in his tone that went beyond the question of a horse. "I expect he might," she said carefully. "Animals get attached quicker than people like to admit. Sometimes people do too." The silence that followed held more than either of them said aloud, and it was Nathan who broke it, first stepping forward close enough that Abigail could see the exhaustion and the hope both fighting for space in his expression. "Come back safe," he said. "This ranch, I don't know what it is anymore without you in it. Tighten the hands, myself included. Things have felt different since you walked through that gate. Better, even with all this trouble stacked up against us." "I'll be back in 2 days," Abigail said softer than she meant to. "Save your worrying for the judge. I can take care of myself on a horse trail, same as I've been taking care of myself my whole life." She left before dawn, riding hard toward her father's old cabin 3 counties over, with Silas Granger's threats and a bank examiner's deadline, and a judge's poisoned opinion, all pressing down on her, like weights she couldn't set aside even for the length of the ride. She thought of Titan's trembling body beneath her in that first mounted lesson, the trust he'd handed over after 4 years of refusing it to anyone. She thought of Nathan's face in the lantern light, the rawness in his voice when he'd asked her to come back safe. She rode faster. The cabin, when she reached it near dusk the following day, sat exactly as she'd left it 3 weeks before dusk, settling over the modest furniture. Her father's presence still lingering in every corner, like something she could almost touch if she reached hard enough. She didn't let herself linger on the grief of it. She went straight for the old trunk in the corner, the one stuffed with decades of paper her father had never once thrown away, and began searching by lantern light, hands moving fast, urgency overriding exhaustion. It took hours. Deed after deed, survey after survey, most of them useless references to ranches long since sold or boundaries long since settled without dispute. Her eyes burned with tiredness. Her hope dimmed with every unhelpful page. And then, near the very bottom of the trunk, she found it, a faded county survey map from 1871, water-stained but legible, bearing an official stamp and a surveyor's signature. She recognized from town. Old Ezra Doyle, dead these past 6 years, but whose original field notes were pinned right there behind the map itself, detailing exact measurements that matched Nathan's father's original claim to the letter. More than that, tucked behind the field notes was a second document, a letter from the county surveyor's office, dated 1879, the same year as the disputed resurvey Silas was relying on. The letter, addressed to a name Abigail didn't recognize, referenced adjustments requested to the northern boundary lines per Mr. G's specifications, with a payment amount noted in the margin that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. Silas Granger's father. It had to be. The timing. The initials, the payment. This wasn't an honest resurvey at all. It was a bought one, decades old, laid in wait like a trap for exactly this moment. Abigail sat back on her heels in the dusty cabin, heart hammering, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to feel something like triumph. "Found you," she whispered to the empty room. And somewhere, she liked to think her father was listening, satisfied that his habit of keeping every scrap of paper had finally paid off in a way neither of them could have predicted. She rode back to Red Hawk Ranch through the night exhaustion, forgotten the documents wrapped carefully in oilcloth and pressed tight against her chest like something precious. She arrived just past dawn, having ridden nearly the entire distance without rest, and found Nathan already awake, pacing the yard, clearly having not slept much himself. "Abigail!" He was at her horse's side before she'd even fully dismounted, hands steadying her as her exhausted legs nearly buckled beneath her. "You're all right. You look half dead." "I'm better than all right," she managed, digging the oilcloth package from her saddlebag with trembling hands. "Nathan, I found it. I found the proof." She laid the document out on the porch steps, and Nathan crouched beside her, reading by the growing morning light, and Abigail watched his face transform as he understood exactly what he was looking at. The original survey, the doctored resurvey. The letter proving payment had changed hands to falsify boundary lines that had cost his family 200 acres for the better part of a decade. "This is it," he breathed. "This is everything." Whitfield can't ignore evidence like this, judge friendly to Granger or not. This is proof plain and documented that the whole dispute was manufactured. "There's more," Abigail said, exhaustion finally catching up to her voice. "If Silas's father falsified this survey for a payment, and Silas has been building his whole claim to your land on top of that lie for years, that's not just a land dispute anymore. That's fraud. That's something a court has to take seriously, judges' friendships notwithstanding." Nathan looked up from the documents, and the expression on his face wasn't triumph exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, like a man who had spent so long expecting to lose that he didn't quite know how to hold the shape of possibly winning. "You did this," he said. "You rode 4 days round trip, half of it through the night, to save a ranch that isn't even yours. I did it because it needed doing, and I was the one who could do it." Abigail pushed herself upright, swaying slightly with exhaustion. "Now, if you don't mind, I've got a horse to check on before I fall over. 2 days is a long time in Titan's world, and I don't intend to lose progress just because I went chasing paperwork." She found Titan restless in his stall, pacing, ears pinning at the sight of an unfamiliar hand who'd tried to feed him that morning. But the moment he caught her scent, the moment her voice reached him across the barn, his whole body changed. The pacing stopped. The tension bled out of his shoulders, and he came to the rail to meet her, the way he'd never once come to meet anybody else. "Missed me, did you?" she murmured, resting her forehead briefly against his velvet nose, and for just a moment, standing there, exhausted and triumphant in equal measure, Abigail let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the impossible really was within reach. But 3 days remained until the hearing, and even with fraud proven on paper, Silas Granger was not a man who lost gracefully, and Abigail had learned enough about men like him in her short life to know that cornered animals, human or otherwise, were always at their most dangerous right before the end. That night past midnight, the barn caught fire. The smell hit Abigail before the sound did smoke thick and acrid curling under the tack shed door, and yanking her out of sleep so fast her heart was already hammering before her eyes had fully opened. Fire! She was screaming it before she'd even gotten her boots on, bursting out into the yard barefoot, and the sight that greeted her stopped her cold for one terrible second. Flames licking up the eastern wall of the barn, orange light throwing wild shadows across the yard and inside. Unmistakable, even over the roar of fire, the sound of Titan screaming. Nathan! He was already there, already running, hauling the bunkhouse door open and bellowing at the hands to grab buckets, grab blankets, grab anything. And Abigail didn't wait for instructions. She ran straight for the barn doors, and Nathan's hand caught her arm hard enough to spin her around. "You are not going in there." "He's going to burn alive. Nathan, let go of me." That's exactly what happened 4 years ago. Nathan's face was wild in the firelight, terror and fury tangled together. "A panicked horse in a burning barn nearly killed me last time, and I am not watching it happen to you." "Then come with me because I am going in there whether you help me or not." Something in her voice must have broken through because Nathan let go of her arm and instead grabbed a horse blanket off the fence rail, dunking it fast in the water trough, and together they went through the barn doors, into smoke so thick Abigail could barely see 3 feet ahead of her. Titan was rearing in his stall, striking the walls. Eyes rolled back to full white, and every instinct in Abigail's body screamed at her to stay back from those flailing hooves. But she pushed that instinct down hard and kept moving toward him, coughing, eyes streaming. "Titan, Titan, it's me!" He didn't hear her. Or he heard her, and the fire was louder, the fear too total. 4 years of trauma detonating all at once inside a burning barn that must have felt to him exactly like the night that broke him in the first place. "Abigail, get back. He'll kill you like this." "I'm not leaving him." She threw the wet blanket over his eyes, a trick her father had taught her for exactly this kind of moment, when a horse's fear came from what it could see, and blinding it gave the mind something else to focus on. And for one heart-stopping second, Titan reared higher hooves, nearly catching her skull, and then something in him simply broke, the way a wave breaks all that violent energy, collapsing into shuddering, sobbing stillness. "That's it," Abigail gasped, smoke burning her throat raw. "That's it. I've got you. I've got you." Nathan wrenched the stall door open, and together they half led, half dragged the trembling stallion out through the smoke, out into the yard, where the cool night air hit like salvation, and Abigail collapsed to her knees in the dirt, coughing so hard she could barely breathe, Titan standing over her, shaking as violently as she was. The hands got the fire out within the hour. It had started small, contained mostly to one wall, and a bucket line had drowned it before it could spread to the main structure. But when Nathan crouched beside the scorched timber, afterward, lantern in hand, his face went hard in a way Abigail hadn't seen before. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "How do you know?" "Because there's a coal oil can sitting empty behind the wall that caught, and I don't keep coal oil stored anywhere near this barn. Haven't in years, not since the storm." He straightened up slowly, jaw tight enough to crack. "Somebody set this fire, Abigail. Somebody wanted this barn burned down with Titan inside it 3 days before the hearing that could save this ranch." Abigail felt something cold and furious settle into her chest. "Silas? I can't prove it, not yet." Nathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "But I know it in my bones." Bull came jogging up from the direction of the road, breathless, torch in hand. "Boss found something you ought to see. Tracks leading off toward the Granger property line. 2 riders moving fast right around the time the fire would have started." Nathan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still and very cold. "Get Charlie word first thing tomorrow. I want those tracks documented, sworn statements from anybody who saw riders on the road tonight. If Silas Granger thinks he can burn my barn down to scare us off this ranch, he is about to learn exactly what kind of mistake that was." Abigail, still catching her breath, still smelling smoke in her own hair, looked over at Titan standing now in the makeshift pen they'd rigged near the house, trembling less by the minute, but watching everything with wide, wary eyes, and felt a fresh wave of fury rise up in her chest. "He tried to kill him," she said quietly. "All this progress, all these weeks, and Silas Granger would have burned him alive without a second thought, just to keep this land. He would have burned all of us without a second thought," Nathan said grimly. "That's the kind of man we're dealing with. I want you to understand that clearly, Abigail, because it changes things. This isn't about rumors and gossip and legal paperwork anymore. This is a man willing to commit arson, willing to risk lives to get what he wants. Then we make sure he doesn't get it." They didn't sleep the rest of that night. Nathan sat up with his rifle across his knees on the porch watching the road, and Abigail sat beside Titan in the makeshift pen, murmuring low and steady to calm him back down from the terror the fire had reawakened in him, undoing. In one night, what had taken weeks to build, or so she feared, until near dawn, exhausted past the point of fear, Titan finally lowered his head and let it rest against her shoulder, and she understood that whatever bond had grown between them, it had survived even this. "We're gonna be okay," she whispered to him. "I promise you we're gonna be okay." She wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself, but she said it anyway because sometimes a promise is the only thing holding two frightened creatures together through the dark. The hearing, when it came 3 days later, was held in the modest county courthouse in Redstone, and Abigail had never seen the town so crowded. Word of the fire had spread fast. Word of everything spread fast in a town this size, and half of Redstone had turned out either out of genuine concern, or Abigail suspected simple hunger for spectacle. Silas Granger sat at the front of the room in a suit too fine for a county courthouse, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable, and when Nathan and Abigail walked in together, Silas's eyes found them immediately, and he smiled, thin, cold, utterly without warmth. "Mr. Brooks," Judge Whitfield said once the room had settled, "you understand the nature of this hearing. Mr. Granger has presented documentation disputing the northern boundary of your property, based on the 1879 county resurvey. Do you have anything to offer in response?" Nathan rose, and Abigail watched his hand steady despite everything as he laid the oilcloth-wrapped documents on the clerk's table. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence the original 1871 survey conducted by County Surveyor Ezra Doyle, along with his original field notes." He paused, letting the clerk take the documents, and then reached for the second item. "I'd also like to submit this letter dated the same year as the disputed resurvey referencing payment made for, and I quote, adjustments requested to the northern boundary lines per Mr. G's specifications." A murmur went through the courtroom. Silas's lawyer was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've had no chance to review." "You'll have every chance, Counselor," Judge Whitfield said, taking the letter himself. Reading it slowly, his expression shifting from mild interest to something considerably harder. "Mr. Granger, would you care to explain to this court who Mr. G might refer to in a letter discussing payment for altered boundary lines dated the same year your family's resurvey conveniently expanded your grazing rights by 200 acres? Silas's composure flickered for the first time since Abigail had ever seen him. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of any such letter, and I'd remind the court that my family's claim has stood unchallenged because no one had found the evidence to challenge it," Nathan cut in, and Judge Whitfield allowed it with a small nod, clearly as interested as everyone else in where this was heading. "Your Honor, I'd also like the court to consider that 3 nights ago, my barn was deliberately set on fire, an act of arson that nearly killed a valuable animal and endangered the lives of everyone on my property. Tracks from that fire lead directly toward the Granger property line." The courtroom erupted into noise, and Judge Whitfield banged his gavel hard, but Abigail could see it in his face, the calculation shifting the friendship with Silas Granger, weighing suddenly much lighter against fraud and arson, laid out plain in front of a room full of witnesses. "Mr. Granger," the judge said once order was restored, "this court will require you to account for both the origins of this letter and your whereabouts 3 nights past. Until such accounting is made to my satisfaction, I am staying any action on the boundary dispute, and I am referring the matter of the fire to the county sheriff for immediate investigation." Silas's face had gone the color of old ash. "Your Honor, this is the law, Mr. Granger, functioning exactly as it's meant to. I suggest you retain separate counsel for the arson matter. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down, and the courtroom broke into a roar of conversation, and Abigail felt Nathan's hand find hers under the table, gripping tight. And when she looked at him, his eyes were bright with something that looked for the first time in longer than she'd known him, like genuine hope. "We did it," he breathed. "Not yet," Abigail said, though she was smiling despite herself. "The examiner's still coming. Titan's still got work ahead of him. But this—" She nodded toward the departing figure of Silas Granger, flanked now by a lawyer who looked considerably less confident than he had an hour before. "This is a start." Silas caught her eye on his way out the door, and whatever composure remained on his face cracked just enough to show the fury underneath it raw and dangerous. "This isn't over, Brooks," he said low, before his lawyer hustled him out into the street. "No," Nathan agreed quietly once he'd gone. "But it's a great deal closer to over than it was yesterday." They rode back to Red Hawk Ranch in something close to triumph. Though the triumph was tempered, 6 days remained until the bank examiner's visit, and Titan, despite the fire, despite the terror it had reawakened, still needed to prove himself capable of more than simply carrying a rider at a walk around a corral. "The bank wants to see a breeding stallion," Nathan said that evening, staring out at Titan in the pen, the horse calmer now, but still carrying tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before the fire. "Not just a horse that tolerates a saddle. They want to see strength capability, the animal my father always said he'd become. I don't know if 6 days is enough time to prove that, especially after what happened." Abigail said nothing for a long moment, watching Titan pace the pen, watching the particular way he kept glancing toward the burned wall of the barn, still visible, even in the dim evening light. "There's a wall," she said finally. "The old stone one on the northern edge of the property. Bull mentioned it to me, once mentioned you never go near it." Nathan's whole body went rigid. "How do you know about that?" "I don't know much, just that something happened there. Something bad." Nathan was quiet a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone low and rough, the voice of a man reaching into a wound he'd kept carefully bandaged for years. "That's where the storm drove him 4 years back. That's where he threw me. I hit that wall hard enough to break 3 ribs and crack my skull, and I lay there in the mud for the better part of an hour before one of the hands found me, and every single day since, I have looked at that wall from a distance and never once gone near it because some part of me is convinced it's cursed, that it takes something from every rider who comes near it." "It's not cursed, Nathan. It's just a wall. What happened there was fear yours and his colliding at the worst possible moment." Abigail stepped closer to him. "But I think that's exactly why it matters. If the bank wants to see Titan proven as a true breeding champion strength capability, the whole animal your father dreamed he'd become, there's no better proof than watching him clear the very obstacle that broke him 4 years ago. And you, riding beside that, watching him do what neither of you could do together back then, that tells its own story too. Not just to the bank, to this whole town. You want him to jump that wall. I want him to reclaim it," Abigail said. "There's a difference." Nathan stared at her like she'd suggested something both insane and utterly necessary, and for a long moment he didn't answer at all. Just looked out at Titan, pacing the pen in the fading light. 6 days, he finally said. 6 days, Abigail agreed. It's enough if we don't waste a single one of them. The next morning they began, and the work was harder than anything that had come before it. Small jumps, first a low rail set just above the ground. Nothing that would frighten, nothing that would test more than Titan's basic willingness to trust Abigail's direction from the saddle. He balked at the first attempt, backing away hard enough that Abigail nearly lost her seat, and she didn't push him. She circled back, tried again, smaller still, until he took it clean and easy. And only then did she raise it inch by careful inch, day by day, always watching his ears, his breathing, the particular set of his shoulders that told her whether he was ready, or whether pushing further would break something instead of building it. By the third day, Titan was clearing rails at 3 feet without hesitation, and Nathan had started riding out to the corral every morning to watch standing at the fence, with an expression Abigail had never seen on him before. Something like wonder mixed with a grief he was slowly, visibly learning to set down. He used to jump like this, Nathan said one morning, watching Titan sail over a 3-foot rail with barely a break in stride. Before the storm, my father used to say he had wings hidden under that black coat. He's finding them again. Because of you. Because of both of us, Abigail said, echoing the words she'd told him the day the saddle finally settled. You never gave up on him, Nathan, not really. You just didn't know how to reach him anymore. That's different from giving up. On the 4th day, disaster nearly struck. A sudden clap of thunder, the first real storm threatening since the night that broke Titan 4 years earlier, sent the stallion into a full panic mid-approach to a jump, and he veered hard, nearly throwing Abigail, nearly crashing through the corral fence in his terror. She fought to stay seated, fought to keep her voice calm, even as her own heart hammered with fear. And it took the better part of 20 minutes, thunder rolling overhead the entire time, before she managed to bring him back down from the panic and dismount, both of them shaking. That's it, Nathan said, running to the fence, face white. That's enough for today. Maybe enough entirely. Abigail, if a storm can undo him like that, what happens if it storms on the day the bank examiner comes? What happens at that wall if thunder rolls through at the wrong moment? Then we prepare for that too, Abigail said, though her hands were still trembling as she stroked Titan's sweat-soaked neck. We can't control the weather, Nathan, but we can teach him that thunder doesn't mean the world's about to end. It just takes time we don't entirely have. We don't have any time left to spare on teaching a horse not to fear the sky, Abigail. We have 5 days. Then we use every hour of every one of them, she said. Because giving up now means Silas Granger wins by default, and I did not ride 4 days round trip and drag proof of his family's fraud into a courtroom just to watch you throw in the towel over a thunderclap. Nathan looked at her, something fierce and grateful and helpless, all tangled together in his expression, and nodded slow. All right, he said. All right, 5 days. They worked through storms, after that small ones at least, whenever the weather cooperated with their need for practice, and Abigail developed a technique her father had used once years back, with a mare terrified of gunfire, pairing the frightening sound with something the animal loved over and over, until the fear and the reward tangled together, and the fear slowly lost its grip. For Titan, the reward was simple: an apple cut into pieces, offered the moment thunder rolled, offered with Abigail's steady voice right alongside it. Until by the 5th day, a distant rumble of thunder made his ears flick with curiosity rather than panic, watching for Abigail's hand instead of bolting for the fence. I didn't think that would work, Nathan admitted, watching it happen with something like awe. My father always said fear and comfort can't occupy the same space for long. Eventually one crowds the other out. Just depends which one you feed more. The night before the demonstration, neither of them slept much. Abigail sat with Titan long past midnight, going over every step of what tomorrow would require. The ride across the property, the approach to the wall, the jump itself, all of it needing to happen, calm and controlled in front of bankers and lawyers and half the county. All of it needing to overcome 4 years of trauma in a single afternoon. Nathan found her there near 2 a.m. and sat down beside her in the straw without a word, the two of them simply keeping vigil together in the dark. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said finally, I want you to know something. Nathan, let me say it. He turned to face her, and in the dim lantern light, Abigail could see everything he'd been carrying laid bare on his face. The exhaustion, the fear, and underneath both of those, something warmer. Something that had been growing quietly for weeks now, unspoken between them. You walked onto this ranch 3 weeks ago with $11 and a flour sack grieving your father, and you have given everything you had left to save a horse and a ranch that weren't even yours to save. I don't know how to repay that. I don't know if there's a way to repay it. But I know that whatever happens tomorrow, whether Titan clears that wall or whether he balks and we lose everything, I am grateful beyond anything I can put into words that you walked through that gate. Abigail's throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all. I didn't do it for repayment, she finally managed. I know. Nathan's hand found hers in the straw, gentle, uncertain the way a man reaches for something he's afraid might not be his to reach for. That's exactly why it matters so much. Neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. They sat there together until the sky began to lighten toward dawn, hands loosely joined. Titan's steady breathing, filling the quiet between them, and when the sun finally broke over the ridge, Abigail rose, brushed the straw from her skirt, and looked at Nathan with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. Let's go show them what he can do. By mid-morning, the northern pasture had filled with more people than Abigail had ever seen gathered in one place outside of a church. Social bankers in stiff suits, lawyers with their ledgers, county officials looking skeptical, and half the ranching families of Redstone drawn by curiosity and gossip. All of them come to watch either a triumph or a disaster unfold in front of the old stone wall that had haunted Nathan Brooks for 4 long years. Silas Granger stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed, a thin smile playing at his mouth that told Abigail he was hoping for failure. He came to watch you lose, Nathan murmured, catching her eye. Then let's disappoint him. The bank examiner, a stern, narrow man named Mr. Pruitt, consulted his pocket watch with obvious impatience. Mr. Brooks, the bank's position remains that this animal's value must be independently verified before any further extension of credit can be considered. I trust you understand the stakes of this demonstration. I understand them perfectly, sir, Nathan said, voice steady, despite everything roiling beneath the surface. If you'll give us a moment. He walked with Abigail toward where Titan stood saddled and waiting, held by Bull, who looked nearly as nervous as Nathan did. The stallion's ears were up alert, watching the unfamiliar crowd with a wariness that made Abigail's stomach clench. He's spooked by all these people, Bull murmured. Ain't seen this many folks in one place probably ever. Abigail approached, slow, murmuring the same low, steady words she'd used every single morning for 3 weeks, and watched Titan's ears turn toward her voice, watched some of the tension bleed slowly out of his shoulders. I know, she said softly. I know it's a lot. But it's just me and you out there in a minute, same as always. Don't matter how many folks are watching. Only matters what's between us. She mounted, and the crowd's murmur died down to something close to silence. And for a long moment, Abigail simply sat there, letting Titan settle, letting her own heartbeat find its calm center, before asking anything of him at all. Then softly, she nudged him forward. They started at a walk crossing the pasture toward the wall, in full view of everyone gathered, and Abigail felt every eye in that field fixed on them, felt the weight of all of it. The bank's assessment, the town's gossip, Silas Granger's smug anticipation of failure, Nathan's whole future hanging in the balance of the next 60 seconds. She pushed all of it aside. There was only the horse beneath her, and the wall ahead, and the steady rhythm of trust they'd built together over 3 impossible weeks. The walk became a trot. The trot became a canter, smooth and controlled Titan stride, lengthening with each passing second, ears forward, now entirely focused, entirely present. The wall came up fast. Abigail felt the whole field hold its breath. She felt Nathan's eyes on her, felt Silas's smirking anticipation, felt 4 years of failure and fear crystallized into this single narrow window of possibility. Come on, she whispered low enough that only Titan could hear it. Come on, we've got this. Just you and me. Same as every morning. 10 strides out. Titan's ears flicked back just once, just a fraction, and Abigail's heart seized with terror that he was about to balk, about to swerve about to relive the exact horror that had broken him 4 years before. 5 strides out. His stride never faltered. 3 strides out. Abigail felt him gather himself beneath her, felt the coiled power of muscle and memory and courage, all converging in a single moment of decision. And then he left the ground. For one suspended, impossible second, horse and rider hung in the air above the stone wall that had broken a man's body and a horse's spirit 4 years earlier, and the whole field seemed to hold its breath along with them. And then they landed clean, balanced, perfect on the far side, and Titan's stride never broke, carrying them forward at a smooth, triumphant canter across the open pasture beyond. The field erupted. Abigail barely heard it at first. The roar of applause and shouting and disbelief, too focused on slowing Titan, gently bringing him back around at an easy walk. Both of them breathing hard, both of them alive with something that felt in that moment indistinguishable from pure joy. When she brought him back around to the crowd, Nathan was already running toward them, and he didn't stop at a respectful distance, the way propriety would have dictated. He reached up, pulled her down out of the saddle, and for one wild, unthinking moment, wrapped his arms around her, right there in front of the entire assembled county, laughing and half-sobbing at once. "You did it," he said into her hair. "God in heaven, Abigail, you did it." "We did it," she corrected. Breathless, laughing herself, now the terror and triumph of the last 3 weeks finally breaking loose all at once. Both of us. All 3 of us. Mr. Pruitt approached his stern expression, finally cracking into something like genuine astonishment, his pocket watch forgotten in his hand. "Mr. Brooks, I have been assessing breeding stock for the bank for 11 years. I have never in my career witnessed a demonstration quite like that one. This animal is not merely serviceable. He is without question one of the finest stallions I have evaluated in this territory." "Does that mean—" "It means, Mr. Brooks, that the bank will be extending your credit, not merely maintaining it. A stallion of this caliber, properly managed, represents an asset far beyond what your current loan reflects." Pruitt actually smiled, thin but genuine. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up by week's end." Behind them, the crowd was still buzzing, still talking, and Abigail caught sight of Silas Granger's face in the middle of it all, pale furious. His smug anticipation curdled into something close to panic. "This isn't finished," he said loud enough to carry stalking toward Nathan, with his composure fraying at the edges. "That fraud accusation, that letter, I'll have my own lawyers prove it a forgery. This ranch is not saved, Brooks, not by a single lucky jump." "It wasn't luck," Nathan said, and his voice carried a new steadiness, a confidence Abigail hadn't heard from him even in the courtroom days before. "It was 3 weeks of work by a woman you tried to slander, tried to scare off with rumors and fire. And as for the letter, Silas, the sheriff's already investigating the arson, and I expect once he starts pulling that thread, a great many things you've spent years hiding are going to come unraveled right alongside it." Silas's face went through several colors in quick succession, and for a moment, Abigail thought he might actually strike Nathan right there in front of the whole gathered county. Instead, he simply turned jaw-clenched and stalked back toward his horse, mounting and riding off without another word, the crowd parting around him, with the particular silence of people who had just watched a bully's power crumble in real time. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Abigail would never fully recall, in order congratulations from ranching families who'd never so much as looked her way, before Bull clapping her on the shoulder so hard she nearly stumbled. Charlie the bank clerk grinning ear to ear as he shook Nathan's hand. The whole weight of 3 desperate weeks finally impossibly beginning to lift. It was near dusk before the crowd thinned enough for Nathan and Abigail to walk back toward the wall alone. Titan grazing peacefully nearby, utterly unbothered now by the very obstacle that had haunted him and Nathan for 4 long years. "I used to think that wall was cursed," Nathan said quietly, looking at the weathered stone in the fading light. "Used to think it took something from every rider brave enough to try it." "Maybe it did," Abigail said. "Maybe it took your fear instead of your body this time. Seems like a fair enough trade." Nathan turned to look at her, and in the golden evening light, Something in his expression had shifted entirely from the man she'd met 3 weeks ago, the guarded, grieving rancher convinced his father's legacy was already lost. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Not for the ranch, not for Titan, for reminding me what it feels like to hope again." "You don't have to thank me," Abigail said softly. "Just don't let go of it. The hope, I mean. It's a fragile thing, easier to lose than folks think." "I don't intend to lose it," Nathan said, and something in the way he said it, looking directly at her rather than at the wall or the horse or anything else, told Abigail he wasn't only talking about hope for the ranch anymore. Neither of them said anything further. They simply stood there together as the sun dropped below the ridge. Titan grazing peacefully beside the wall that no longer held any power over either of them. 3 weeks of fear and fire and fraud, finally for one quiet evening, giving way to something that felt at long last like the beginning of peace. The paperwork from the bank arrived 3 days later, official and stamped, and Nathan read it twice at the kitchen table before setting it down with hands that weren't quite steady. "Full extension," he said. "Not just maintained, extended, enough to cover the breeding program expansion my father always wanted." He looked up at Abigail, disbelief still fresh on his face, even after 3 days of good news piling on top of more good news. "I keep waiting to wake up." "You're not asleep, Nathan." Abigail poured coffee into his cup before he had to ask. "You earned this. Titan earned this. Took the both of you 4 years and 1 desperate month to get here, but you got here." Before he could answer, hoof falls sounded in the yard fast and urgent, and both of them were on their feet before the rider had even called out. It was Charlie again. Abigail had started to think the poor young man did nothing but ride between town and the ranch, delivering news that made grown men go pale. "Mr. Brooks." Charlie was breathless, but this time there was something almost gleeful under the urgency and eagerness that hadn't been there during his previous visits. "Sheriff's men searched the Granger property this morning. Found coal oil cans in the tack room matching the one from your fire, same manufacturer mark and everything. And that's not the half of it." "What's the other half?" Nathan asked, already moving toward the porch rail. "They found a strong box in Silas's study, old letters. Looks like his father kept records of every bribe he ever paid to surveyors and county clerks going back near 30 years. Your northern boundary wasn't the only property line the Grangers bought and paid for. There's at least 4 other ranches mentioned. Sheriff reckons there might be more once the county starts digging." Abigail felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still coiled tight. "So the fraud isn't just proven. It's a pattern. Judge Whitfield's already talking about reopening every boundary case the Grangers have ever touched," Charlie said. "And Silas, well, he's not in a position to be threatening anybody's water rights for a good long while. Sheriff arrested him this morning on the arson charge. Bail's set high enough he can't hardly touch it, not with his assets tied up in the fraud investigation." Nathan was quiet a long moment, staring out toward the eastern road where Silas's men had ridden that terrible night with their torch and their threats. 4 years, he finally said. 4 years I let that man circle this ranch like a vulture, and I never once thought to ask how deep his corruption went. I just assumed I was fighting one crooked land claim. Turns out I was standing at the edge of something a great deal bigger. Sometimes it takes somebody willing to dig through a dusty old trunk to find out how big, Abigail said, and Nathan managed a tired, grateful smile. Charlie tipped his hat, clearly pleased to be delivering good news for once, instead of bad, and rode off toward town. And Nathan turned to Abigail with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded, something like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "It's really over," he said. "The Granger part of it, yes." Abigail allowed herself a small smile. "The Titan part's really just beginning." They walked out to the corral together where the stallion stood grazing in the morning sun, utterly unbothered by everything that had nearly destroyed the world around him just days before. He lifted his head at the sound of their approach ears pricking forward, and came to the rail without any hesitation at all, nosing at Abigail's shoulder, in a gesture that had become as natural to him now as breathing. "Look at him," Nathan said softly. 4 years, I couldn't get within 10 feet of him, without him near killing himself trying to get away. Now he greets you like an old friend every single morning. He greets both of us, Abigail corrected. And it was true Titan had over the past week begun extending the same cautious trust toward Nathan that he'd given Abigail from the start, accepting his presence at the rail, his hand on his neck, his voice in the quiet mornings. That's the part I want you to understand, Nathan. I didn't just gentle a horse. I gave him back to you. The trust was always yours to have. He just needed to believe it was safe to give it again. Nathan didn't answer right away. He reached out and rested his hand against Titan's neck, and the stallion leaned into the touch, unhurried, unafraid, and something in Nathan's throat worked before he finally spoke. "My father used to stand right here," he said, voice rough. "Right in this exact spot every morning with this horse following him around the pasture like a dog trailing its master. I used to think I'd lost that forever. Lost the horse, lost my father's legacy, lost every piece of what this ranch was supposed to mean." He looked over at Abigail, eyes bright. "You gave that back to me, all of it." "You gave it back to yourself," Abigail said gently. "I just helped you find the door again." Word of the demonstration at the wall had spread through Redstone faster than the fire itself had, and over the following days, Abigail began to notice a shift in how the town regarded her. Not the open mockery of her first arrival, not even the grudging tolerance that had built slowly over 3 weeks, but something closer to genuine respect offered by people who'd once laughed her out of earshot without a second thought. Mrs. Whitcomb, the widow who'd come to stay at the ranch house during the worst of the gossip, took to introducing Abigail around town, with unmistakable pride, as though she'd personally trained the horse herself. The general store owner, who'd once eyed Abigail's threadbare dress with open suspicion when she'd first come through town, now greeted her by name and pressed a free spool of thread into her basket. "For the trouble you went through saving that ranch." Even Bull, gruff as ever, had taken to defending her reputation in the saloon whenever anyone brought up the old rumors, loud enough that word of his defense had made its way back to Abigail secondhand within a day. "Folks change their tune quick once they see results," Bull said one afternoon, watching Abigail work Titan through a series of controlled jumps in the corral, each one cleaner and more confident than the last. "Don't mean much coming from people who wouldn't give you the time of day a month back." "It means something," Abigail said, not looking away from the horse. "Not because I need their approval, because it means Nathan's got a whole town behind him now instead of one whispering against him. That matters for the ranch, even if it don't matter much to my own pride." "You care more about him than the ranch," Bull observed, not unkindly. "Might as well admit it. Rest of us already figured it out weeks back." Abigail felt heat rise in her face and kept her eyes fixed determinedly on Titan's next approach to the rail. "I care about doing the work I came here to do." "Sure," Bull said, grinning now, clearly enjoying himself. "That's why the boss can't hardly look at anything but you these days, and you go red as a barn door every time he does it." "Don't you have chores, Bull?" "Plenty," he said, still grinning, and ambled off toward the barn, leaving Abigail alone with her flushed cheeks and a horse who seemed in his own quiet way entirely amused by the whole exchange. That evening, Nathan found her sitting on the porch steps as the sun went down and settled beside her, without asking, the two of them, watching the sky burn orange and gold over the ridge in comfortable silence for a long while before either spoke. "Bull tells me you had words today," Nathan said, finally, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Bull talks too much." "Bull's not wrong, usually, even when he talks too much." Nathan turned to look at her directly, and Abigail felt her heart pick up its pace under the weight of his attention. "Abigail, I've been trying to find the right way to say something for the better part of a week now, and every time I work up the courage, something else catches fire, or a bank examiner shows up, or Silas Granger threatens to ruin us all over again, and the moment slips away." "Nothing's on fire right now," Abigail said, quiet, her heart hammering. "No," Nathan agreed. "No, for the first time in longer than I can remember, nothing's on fire and nobody's threatening this ranch, and I find myself sitting here with absolutely no excuse left to keep from telling you the truth." He took a slow breath. "I think I started falling for you somewhere around the third morning, watching you sit outside that stall, doing nothing but breathing calm, while a horse that had broken 12 men decided whether or not to trust you. I told myself it was gratitude. Told myself it was relief, watching hope come back into a place I thought had lost it for good. But it isn't just that Abigail. Hasn't been for weeks now. Abigail's throat had gone tight, and for a moment she couldn't find words at all. 3 weeks of grief and fear, and desperate work, all tangled up suddenly with something far softer, far more frightening in its own way than any of it. "I buried my father the same morning I walked through your gate," she finally said, voice unsteady. "I told myself I came here for $11 and a place to sleep and nothing more. Told myself I couldn't afford to want anything beyond getting through each day. But somewhere between that first morning at the stall and watching Titan clear that wall with you running toward us afterward, I stopped believing that story I was telling myself." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, I think I started falling for you too." Nathan Brooks, somewhere around the same third morning, watching a man who'd lost everything, still find it in him to hope even when hoping had only ever brought him pain before. Nathan's hand found hers on the porch step, gentle, uncertain in the way of a man who'd been disappointed by hope too many times to trust it fully, even now. And Abigail turned her palm to meet his, lacing their fingers together as the last light faded from the sky. "I'm not offering you charity, and I'm not offering you obligation," Nathan said softly. "I'm offering you a partnership if you'll have it. This ranch, this life, I don't want to build it back up alone anymore. I want to build it with you if that's something you'd want too. I've spent my whole life moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to plant roots," Abigail said, and felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "I didn't come here looking for a home, Nathan. I came here looking for $11 worth of work. But I think I found something a great deal bigger than I was looking for." Neither of them said anything else for a long while. They simply sat together as the stars came out over Red Hawk Ranch, hands joined hearts settling into something neither had let themselves believe was possible, even a month before. And somewhere out in the pasture, Titan's contented breathing carried faintly on the evening breeze, a horse and two people alike finally fully at peace. The trial of Silas Granger began 3 weeks later, and Abigail sat beside Nathan in the same courthouse where the boundary dispute had first begun unraveling, watching as prosecutor after witness laid out the full scope of what the Granger family had built over 30 years of quiet, patient corruption. The arson charge alone would have been enough to see Silas imprisoned for a considerable stretch. But the fraud investigation, once begun, had spread far beyond Nathan's boundary dispute. 4 other ranching families across the county came forward. Once word spread that the Granger schemes had finally been exposed, each with their own stories of altered surveys, forged deeds, water rights quietly stolen away through bribed officials, and falsified paperwork stretching back decades. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said near the trial's end, "the pattern here is unmistakable. The defendant and his late father built their fortune not through honest ranching, but through the systematic theft of land and water rights from their neighbors, protected for years by corrupted officials, and by the simple fact that no one had the resources or the courage to challenge them directly. It was only when Mr. Brooks, aided by Miss Carter's diligence in recovering original county records, finally exposed one instance of this fraud that the entire scheme began to unravel. Silas sat at the defendant's table, his fine suit rumpled now, his composure entirely gone, and when the verdict finally came down guilty on all counts, arson and fraud, both a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the better part of 2 decades, he didn't even manage the cold, mocking smile that had once been his trademark. He simply sat there hollowed out, a man whose entire carefully constructed world had collapsed because one grieving woman had refused to let a broken horse and a broken ranch go down without a fight. Outside the courthouse afterward, the ranching families whose land had been stolen back gathered around Nathan and Abigail with a gratitude that bordered on reverence. And Abigail found herself for the first time in her adult life standing at the center of something that felt less like survival and more like belonging. "You gave us back 30 years of stolen land," one older rancher said, gripping Abigail's hand with both of his. "Wasn't just Nathan's boundary you fixed, Miss Carter. You fixed something that's been rotten in this county longer than most of us have been alive." I just went looking through an old trunk, Abigail said, uncomfortable with the praise even now. The credit belongs to my father really for never throwing away a scrap of paper in 40 years of ranch work. Credit belongs to whoever's got the sense to look, the rancher said. And the courage to keep looking, even when everybody around them's laughing at the effort. That's you, Miss Carter, whether you want the credit or not. That evening, back at Red Hawk Ranch, Nathan gathered the hands together in the yard, Bull and the others who'd laughed at Abigail that very first day, who'd watched her transform from an object of ridicule into the reason their jobs, their home, their whole way of life had been saved. I want to say something, Nathan announced, standing beside Abigail with Titan grazing peacefully behind them in the golden evening light. 4 years ago, I nearly lost everything my father built. I lost my confidence, lost my hope, lost for a long while any belief that this ranch had a future worth fighting for. A month ago, a stranger walked through that gate with nothing but an old rope and $11, and every single one of you laughed at her. Myself included, if I'm honest about it. A murmur of embarrassed agreement moved through the gathered hands. She didn't ask for your respect, Nathan continued. She didn't demand it, didn't fight for it directly. She simply did the work every single day, patient beyond anything I believed possible. And she earned it the hard way, the same way she earned Titan's trust, one honest day at a time. I owe her this ranch. I owe her Titan. And... He paused, glancing at Abigail with a warmth that made her chest ache with something close to joy. I owe her considerably more than that, though that's a matter between the two of us. Bull cleared his throat loudly, grinning despite himself. Reckon we all owe you an apology, Miss Carter, for the laughing that first day. Won't happen again, not from any of us. Apology accepted, Abigail said, smiling. Though I'll admit watching all of you eat those words has been almost as satisfying as watching Titan clear that wall. Laughter rippled through the yard, warm and easy. The particular laughter of people who'd been through hardship together and come out the other side whole, and Abigail felt something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't felt since before her father's fever took hold. The simple, profound relief of belonging somewhere to someone without condition or reservation. The breeding program expansion began in earnest that autumn, funded now by the bank's extended credit and bolstered by Titan's reputation, which had spread throughout the territory faster than anyone could have predicted. Ranchers from as far as Cheyenne and Laramie began writing to Nathan, inquiring about breeding rights, about purchasing offspring, about the remarkable stallion who'd gone from the horse no one could ride to the finest breeding animal in the region. I got another letter today, Nathan said one evening, reading by lamplight at the kitchen table while Abigail worked mending a bridle nearby. The two of them settled into the easy domesticity that had grown between them over the preceding weeks. Rancher up near Cheyenne wants to send 3 mares down for breeding come spring, offering good money for it too. Titan's earning his keep several times over, Abigail said, not looking up from her work. Titan's earning considerably more than that. Nathan set the letter down and looked at her, something thoughtful in his expression. You know, word's spreading about more than just Titan's bloodline. Folks are asking about your methods too. The way you gentled him. 2 different ranchers this month alone have written asking if you'd consider training their own difficult stock. Abigail's hands stilled on the bridle. Me training for other ranches. Word travels fast in ranching country. And apparently the story of a woman gentling the horse that broke 12 professional trainers has traveled about as far as any story I've ever heard tell of. Nathan smiled, warm and genuine. You built something here, Abigail. Not just with Titan. With your whole approach, the patience, the understanding, the refusal to force what could be earned instead. That's worth something to a lot of folks who've got their own broken horses and don't know what to do about them. I never thought about training as a business, Abigail admitted slowly. Always thought of it as just what my father taught me. Something I did because it needed doing, not something folks would pay for. Maybe it's time to think about it differently, Nathan said. This ranch has room for a proper training operation alongside the breeding program. You could take on students, teach your methods to the next generation of horsemen and horsewomen who'd rather build trust than break spirits. Seems to me that's a legacy worth building, same as any breeding program. Abigail considered this for a long moment, turning the idea over, The way she might turn over an old family recipe, checking it for weaknesses, for possibilities she hadn't yet considered. My father used to talk about that. Training other trainers, spreading his methods further than just the horses he worked with directly. Never had the chance to build it himself. Moved around too much, never had a place to call home long enough to plant that kind of root. You've got a place now, Nathan said quietly, if you want it. I want it, Abigail said, and meant it entirely, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember that the future stretching out ahead of her held more promise than uncertainty. The training program began small that winter, just 2 young ranch hands from a neighboring spread, sent to learn Abigail's patient methods on a pair of difficult colts that had resisted every traditional approach their owners had tried. Abigail taught the way her father had taught her, slow and deliberate, emphasizing patience over force observation, over assumption. And within weeks, both young men were reporting remarkable progress with animals that had seemed just a month before entirely unmanageable. You've got a gift for teaching, same as you've got a gift for horses, Nathan observed one evening, watching Abigail patiently correct one young hand's approach to a nervous colt in the corral. Never seen anybody explain it quite the way you do. Like you're translating something the rest of us can't quite hear. My father used to say the horse is always talking, Abigail said, not taking her eyes off her student. Most folks just never learned the language. I'm not teaching anything new. I'm just teaching people to listen better than they've been taught to listen before. That listening, that patience, that refusal to force what could instead be earned, it had become, Abigail realized, as the winter deepened and the training program grew. Not just her father's legacy carried forward, but something entirely her own, built on Red Hawk Ranch soil, growing roots deeper than she'd ever let herself imagine roots could grow. Nathan proposed on a cold morning in early December, not with elaborate ceremony, but with the same quiet, deliberate honesty that had characterized everything between them since that first desperate month standing beside Titan's pen as the stallion grazed peacefully nearby, snow dusting the ground around them, Nathan's breath fogging in the cold air as he spoke. I've been thinking about how to do this properly, he said, and every version I imagined felt wrong somehow. Too formal, too far from what actually brought us together. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small ring, simple, unadorned, clearly not new. This was my mother's. My father gave it to her the same year he brought Titan's sire over from Kentucky, told her it represented everything he hoped to build with her, patient and lasting, same as good breeding stock takes generations to perfect. Abigail's hands had gone still. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. I'm not asking you to save anything else, Abigail, Nathan continued, voice steady, despite the vulnerability plain in his eyes. The ranch is saved. Titan is saved. My family's legacy is saved more thoroughly than I ever believed possible a month ago. I'm asking you to build something new alongside me now, not out of desperation, not out of gratitude, but because I cannot imagine a single morning of my life from here forward that I don't want to spend watching you gentle something broken into something whole. Nathan Brooks. Abigail managed tears freezing nearly as fast as they fell in the cold morning air. Are you comparing our courtship to horse breeding? I am a rancher, Nathan said, laughing despite the seriousness of the moment. It's the finest comparison I know how to make, and I mean every word of it as the highest compliment I've got in me. Then yes, Abigail said, laughing and crying both now. Yes, Nathan, I'll build whatever you want to build so long as we build it together. He slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at composure, and behind them, entirely unbothered by the significance of the moment. Titan continued grazing in the winter morning light, occasionally lifting his great head to watch the 2 humans who had between them taught him what trust could look like when it was finally patiently fully earned. Word of the engagement spread through Redstone with the same speed every other piece of news about Red Hawk Ranch had traveled that remarkable year, and this time there was no gossip attached to it, no whispered speculation about propriety. Only genuine celebration from a town that had watched a grieving stranger and a broken-hearted rancher build something extraordinary out of the wreckage both their lives had become. Mrs. Whitcomb, who'd stayed on at the ranch house through the autumn and had become something like a surrogate mother to Abigail, in the months since wept openly when Abigail showed her the ring, and immediately began planning a wedding with an enthusiasm that suggested she'd been waiting for this exact outcome since the day she'd first arrived to serve as chaperone. "I knew it the very first week," she declared, holding Abigail's hand and examining the ring with obvious delight. "The way that man looked at you even when he thought nobody was watching. Never seen a man fall so hard and try so poorly to hide it." "I wasn't hiding it that poorly," Nathan protested from across the room, and Mrs. Whitcomb waved him off with the easy dismissiveness of a woman who'd raised enough children to know exactly how transparent a smitten man could be. The wedding took place the following spring in the same northern pasture where Titan had cleared the stone wall that had haunted Nathan for 4 long years. The ceremony held close enough to the wall that its presence felt less like a shadow now and more like a witness, a testament to everything they'd overcome together to arrive at this particular hard-won happiness. Half the county turned out ranching families who'd once been strangers, now bound together by shared history and shared gratitude for a fraud finally exposed, a corruption finally rooted out, a community finally freed from decades of quiet theft they'd never fully understood was happening around them. Bull stood as one of Nathan's groomsmen, looking uncomfortable in his good suit, but grinning ear to ear throughout the entire ceremony. Charlie the bank clerk attended too, along with Mr. Pruitt, who'd become something of an unlikely friend to Nathan over the months since his remarkable assessment of Titan's value. And Titan himself stood nearby throughout the ceremony, calm and steady, decorated with wildflowers braided into his mane by the ranch hand's children, watching the two humans who'd rebuilt his trust exchange vows that echoed in their own way. Everything he'd learned from them both, that patience outlasted force, that trust once broken could be rebuilt one honest day at a time, and that the deepest wounds given enough gentle attention could heal into something stronger than they'd ever been before. "I take you," Nathan said, voice thick with emotion. "Not because you saved this ranch, though you did, and not because you saved that horse, though you did that too. I take you because you taught me that hope isn't something you either have or you don't. It's something you choose one patient day at a time, even when choosing it seems impossible. I take you," Abigail said in return, tears bright in her eyes. "Because you never once gave up on believing something broken could be made whole again, even when every trainer, every neighbor, every voice around you insisted otherwise. That kind of faith is rare. Nathan Brooks and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it was well placed." When the preacher pronounced them married, the whole gathered crowd erupted into applause, and somewhere in the noise and celebration, Titan let out a long, contented breath and lowered his great head to graze once more entirely unbothered by the joyful chaos surrounding him. A stallion finally fully at peace in the home he'd nearly lost, standing beside the wall that no longer represented anything except the distance. Two broken hearts, human and horse alike, had traveled together to find their way back to wholeness. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the last of the guests began the ride back toward town, Nathan found Abigail standing alone beside the stone wall, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same colors that had marked the evening of Titan's triumphant jump nearly a year before. "Regretting anything?" he asked, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers automatically, now a habit worn comfortable through months of practice. "Not one single thing," Abigail said, leaning into him. "I walked through that gate with $11 and a flour sack, grieving everything I'd ever known, expecting nothing except maybe enough work to keep from starving. I never once imagined I'd walk away with all of this instead." "Neither did I," Nathan admitted. "I expected to lose this ranch, lose Titan, lose whatever was left of my father's legacy, and instead I gained a wife, a partner, a training program that's already changing how half the county handles their livestock, and a horse who greets me every morning like I've never once disappointed him." He looked over at her eyes, soft in the fading light. "Turns out the thing I thought was my greatest failure was actually waiting for exactly the right person to prove it was never broken beyond repair. Just misunderstood." "That's true of more than horses," Abigail said quietly. "Yes," Nathan agreed, pulling her closer as the last light faded from the sky. "I've come to understand that it is." 2 years passed at Red Hawk Ranch, and the changes those years brought settled over the property like good weather after a long drought. Steady welcome, the kind of change that didn't announce itself with fanfare, but simply took root and grew. Abigail stood at the corral fence on a warm spring morning, watching a girl no older than 16 work a nervous yearling through the same patient exercises she herself had once used on Titan, and felt something close to her father's presence standing beside her watching too. "She's got the gift," Nathan said, coming to stand at her side, coffee in hand, watching their newest student with the same quiet pride he brought to everything happening on the ranch these days. Third week, and that colt's already leaning into her hand instead of shying from it. "She listens," Abigail said. "That's the whole secret, same as it's always been. Most folks want to talk at a horse until it does what they want. She actually stops and listens for what he's telling her back." The training program had grown considerably beyond those first 2 ranch hands from the neighboring spread. What had begun as a favor to nervous neighbors with difficult stock had become over 2 years something Abigail could scarcely have imagined for herself back when she'd walked through Nathan's gate with nothing but a flour sack and $11. Word had traveled far beyond Redstone. Now letters arrived regularly from ranches in Montana, from as far south as Colorado, asking whether Miss Carter, now Mrs. Brooks, might take on a student, might share her methods, might come consult on some particularly stubborn or traumatized animal that traditional trainers had given up on entirely. "Got another letter this morning," Nathan said, producing it from his coat pocket. "Rancher up near Sheridan. Says he's got a mare who won't let anybody near her foal, near killed a hand who tried to check on it. Says he heard about Titan, heard about your methods, wants to know if you'd consider making the trip." Abigail took the letter, reading it over with the same careful attention she gave every case that came her way now. Sheridan's a long ride. 4 days each way, maybe 5 with a covered wagon for supplies. Nathan watched her consider it, and Abigail could see in his expression that he already knew what her answer would be, had known it before she'd even finished reading the letter. "You want to take this one yourself or send one of your students?" "This one I want to see myself," Abigail said. "A mare protecting her foal that fierce, that's not meanness. That's fear dressed up as violence, same as it always is. But it takes experience to know the difference between a horse that needs patience and a horse that's genuinely dangerous to approach. I won't send a student into that without going first myself." "Then we'll leave within the week," Nathan said, and Abigail smiled at the easy way he'd folded himself into her plans, the way he always did now, not because he doubted her capability. She'd learned over 2 years of marriage, but because he simply preferred being wherever she was. Whatever work that meant sharing. Titan, grazing peacefully in the near pasture, lifted his great head at the sound of their voices and ambled over to the fence, nosing at Abigail's shoulder in the same gesture of easy affection that had become as natural to him as breathing. He was 7 years old now, no longer the lean, wild-eyed stallion who'd nearly killed 12 trainers before her. His coat had filled out glossy and healthy. His eyes carried none of the wariness that had once haunted him, and his temperament had settled into something Abigail could only describe as contentment. The particular piece of a creature who had finally fully learned that the world did not owe him only pain. "You'll hold down the ranch while we're gone," Abigail told him, scratching beneath his mane the way he'd come to love. "Keep an eye on your children for us." Titan's children. 3 foals now sired over 2 breeding seasons, each one showing the same powerful conformation, and more importantly, the same gentle temperament Abigail had spent that first desperate month coaxing back into their father. The breeding program had exceeded even Nathan's most hopeful projections. Ranchers from 3 territories now competing for the chance to breed their mares with Titan's line, and the income from that program alone had transformed Red Hawk Ranch from a property teetering on bankruptcy into one of the most respected operations in the region. But it wasn't the money that mattered most to Abigail, watching Titan's foals grow into the same trusting, capable animals their father had become. It was the proof walking around on 4 legs in the near pasture that what had been broken could be mended, that trauma didn't have to define an entire bloodline, that patience and understanding passed down properly could undo generations of fear in a fraction of the time it had taken to create it. The trip to Sheridan proved harder than either of them anticipated. The mare in question, a chestnut named Duchess by her owner, had indeed grown dangerous. In her fear, she'd already injured 2 hands attempting to approach her foal, and by the time Abigail and Nathan arrived, the rancher had all but given up hope of ever gentling her again. She weren't always like this, the rancher, a weathered man named Otis Fielding, explained as he led them toward the isolated pen where Duchess paced with her foal pressed close against her flank. Good mare, gentle as they come, right up until a mountain lion got into the foaling shed last spring. Foal survived, but Duchess ain't been right since. Won't let nobody near that colt, not even to check him for injury or sickness. I got half a mind to sell them both off before she does real damage to somebody. Don't sell her, Abigail said immediately, watching the mare's wild, protective eyes track their approach even from 30 feet away. That's not a mean horse, Mr. Fielding. That's a mother who watched something try to kill her baby and hasn't figured out yet that the danger's past. Give me some time with her before you give up. It took 9 days, considerably faster than the month Titan had required. Though Abigail suspected the shorter timeline had as much to do with experience as with the difference between the 2 cases. But by the time Abigail and Nathan packed up to head back toward Red Hawk Ranch, Duchess stood calm at the rail, allowing Otis Fielding to run gentle hands over her foal for the first time in nearly a year. Her wariness finally fully surrendered. I don't know how to thank you, Otis said, pressing payment into Abigail's hands that she tried unsuccessfully to refuse. Whole territory's gonna hear about this, Mrs. Brooks. Man from Sheridan wrote me just last month asking if I knew anybody who could handle a horse nobody else could reach. Reckon I know exactly who to send him to now. The ride home gave Abigail and Nathan 4 full days of quiet conversation, the kind that had become precious to both of them amid the growing demands of the ranch, the training program, the breeding operation that required constant attention. They talked about Duchess, about the particular fear that had driven her violence, about how closely it echoed what they'd witnessed in Titan 2 years before. You ever think about how many horses are out there right now? Nathan mused one evening around their campfire, suffering the same way. Titan suffered the same way Duchess suffered, with nobody around. Who knows how to reach them? Just written off as dangerous or crazy or beyond saving. More than I like to think about, Abigail admitted. That's part of why I keep saying yes to these trips, even when it means leaving the ranch, leaving the training program in my students' hands for weeks at a time. Every horse I don't reach is a horse that might end up destroyed or sold off to somebody who'll break it through cruelty instead of patience, same as what nearly happened to Titan before I walked through your gate. Nathan was quiet a long moment watching the fire, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a thoughtfulness Abigail recognized as the sound of an idea taking shape. What if it wasn't just you making these trips? What if we built something bigger, a proper school right there on Red Hawk Ranch, where you could train not just horses, but horsemen and horsewomen from across the territory in your father's methods, people who could then go out and reach the Duchesses and Titans in their own counties, instead of waiting for you to make a week-long ride every time trouble arose. Abigail sat up straighter, the idea catching hold of her imagination with immediate powerful force. A proper school. Not just a handful of students learning as they happened to visit, but a real program structured teaching my father's whole philosophy from the ground up. Your father spent his whole life wanting to build exactly that, Nathan said. Never had the chance moving ranch to ranch the way you two did. But you've got a home now, Abigail. You've got a ranch with room to grow a reputation that draws students already, and a partner who's got no interest in stopping you from building whatever legacy you want to build. By the time they rode back through the gates of Red Hawk Ranch 4 days later, the shape of the idea had solidified into something concrete enough to begin planning immediately. And Abigail spent that whole first evening back sketching out by lamplight what a proper training school might look like. A curriculum built from everything her father had taught her, expanded by everything she'd learned herself over years of practice, structured to take raw students and turn them into trainers, capable of reaching even the most traumatized, most dangerous animals other methods had given up on. The Carter School of Horsemanship, as Abigail eventually named it in honor of her father, opened its doors the following autumn with 6 students in its first formal class. Young men and women from across the territory, drawn by Titan's now legendary story. and by Abigail's growing reputation as the only trainer in 3 states who'd never once failed to reach an animal others had declared unreachable. Bull of all people became the school's first permanent instructor, besides Abigail herself, having spent 2 years absorbing her methods simply by watching, by asking questions, by gradually transforming from the skeptical ranch hand who'd once called her the sitting woman into one of the most capable horsemen on the property. "Never thought I'd end up teaching," Bull admitted to Abigail one morning, watching a nervous new student work through the same basic patience exercises Abigail had used on Titan that first desperate month years before. "Figured I'd just be hauling feed and mending fences till I was too old to do either." "You've got a gift for explaining things plain," Abigail said. "Same gift I'm trying to teach these students to develop in themselves. Doesn't matter how well you understand a horse if you can't help somebody else understand what you're seeing. That's half of teaching right there." "Learned from the best," Bull said, and Abigail smiled, remembering the man who'd once laughed at her from across the yard, now standing beside her, as a trusted colleague, proof itself of how thoroughly patience and time could transform even the most stubborn skepticism into genuine respect. The school's reputation grew faster than either Abigail or Nathan had anticipated drawing. Not just students eager to learn, but attention from unexpected quarters as well. A journalist from a Cheyenne newspaper arrived one autumn morning, notebook in hand, having heard the full story of Titan's transformation from a rancher passing through Redstone, and spent 3 days at Red Hawk Ranch documenting everything from the training methods to the now famous stone wall where the demonstration had taken place 2 years before. "Mrs. Brooks," the journalist said, watching Abigail work with a new student and a particularly anxious colt, "the story I'm hearing is remarkable enough on its own merits. A horse that broke 12 trainers gentled by a grieving stranger in a single month. But what strikes me most is what's grown from it since. A training school. A breeding program that's revolutionizing bloodlines across 3 territories. A fraud investigation that exposed decades of corruption and returned stolen land to a dozen ranching families. All from one woman walking through one gate with $11 in her boot. I didn't build any of it alone," Abigail said, as she always said when the credit threatened to pile too heavily on her shoulders. "Nathan believed in what I was trying to do, even when it seemed impossible. Bull and my other students carry the work forward every single day. And Titan himself, he's the one who proved the whole philosophy could work, that patience really could reach what force never could." The article, when it finally ran, spread the story of Red Hawk Ranch and the Carter School of Horsemanship further than Abigail could have imagined, drawing inquiries from as far as California from ranchers who'd read the account and recognized their own struggling animals in every detail of Titan's story. Letters arrived by the dozens in the weeks following publication, and Abigail found herself for the first time having to turn away requests simply because there weren't enough hours in the day to answer every call for help. "We could expand again," Nathan suggested one evening, reviewing the growing stack of correspondence with her at the kitchen table, where they still, despite everything the ranch had grown into, preferred to handle their planning. "Bring on more instructors, take more students. There's clearly demand enough to support it." "There is," Abigail agreed, though something in her voice carried hesitation Nathan recognized immediately. But I don't want to grow so fast that we lose what made this work in the first place," Abigail said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud. "My father always said patience couldn't be rushed, couldn't be mass-produced. If we grow too big too fast, we risk becoming exactly the kind of factory training operation I've spent my whole life trying to prove wrong. The kind that treats horses like products instead of individuals, that teaches technique without teaching the deeper understanding underneath it." "Then we grow slow," Nathan said simply. "Same as we've done everything else. One student, one horse, one honest day at a time." It was, Abigail reflected, exactly the kind of answer she'd have hoped for, and exactly the kind of partnership she'd never quite let herself imagine finding back when she'd walked those last 4 miles into Redstone with nothing but grief and $11 weighing down her boot. The following spring brought a visitor Abigail hadn't expected, one of the 12 original trainers who'd failed with Titan years before, a weathered man named Jasper Cole, who arrived at the ranch gate on a quiet Tuesday morning, hat in hand, looking considerably older than the 4 years since his failure should have accounted for. "Mrs. Brooks," he said when Abigail came out to meet him, uncertain what had brought him back after so long. "I expect you don't remember me. I'm one of the ones who tried with that horse of yours years back before you ever come along. Left here with a broken collarbone and considerably less pride than I'd walked in with." "I remember the name," Abigail said carefully. "What brings you back, Mr. Cole?" Jasper's weathered face worked through something complicated before he finally spoke. "Heard about your school. Heard about everything you built here since. And I got to thinking I spent 15 years training horses the only way I ever learned how breaking them down till they had no fight left calling it discipline, when really it was just cruelty dressed up respectable. Never once thought there might be another way, until I heard what you did with a horse that had already beat me clean." He turned his hat over in his hands, clearly working up to something difficult. "I'm 53 years old, Mrs. Brooks. Bit old to be starting fresh at anything. But I got no interest in spending whatever years I got left training horses the way I always have, not now that I know there's a better way. I come to ask if you'd take on an old, stubborn student, even one who's got more to unlearn than most." Abigail studied him for a long moment, seeing in his weathered, uncertain face something of what Titan himself must have carried in those early days, a creature shaped by years of one particular understanding, uncertain whether a different way of being was even possible for him anymore. "Age has got nothing to do with whether a person can learn patience, Mr. Cole," she finally said. "Only thing that matters is whether you're willing to unlearn everything you think you already know. That's harder for some folks than starting fresh entirely. You willing to do that hard work?" "I come 4 days to ask you the question," Jasper said. "Reckon that answers it plain enough." Jasper Cole became over the following months one of the school's most devoted students, working twice as hard as the younger recruits to unlearn 15 years of harsh training methods. And Abigail found a particular satisfaction in watching a man who'd once broken horses through fear learn slowly and humbly to gentle them through patience instead. It struck her watching him work that this was perhaps the truest measure of everything she and Nathan had built together. Not just a horse transformed, not just a ranch saved, but an entire philosophy of understanding, spreading outward through the territory, changing not just animals, but the very people who worked with them. By the 3rd year, Red Hawk Ranch had become something neither Abigail nor Nathan could have fully imagined that first desperate month when everything hung on $11 and one terrified horse's willingness to trust a stranger. The breeding program had expanded to include not just Titan's line, but several other rescued and rehabilitated stallions, each one gentled through Abigail's methods before ever standing at stud. The training school had grown to nearly 20 students at any given time, drawing from territories as far as Nevada. Each one learning not just technique, but the deeper philosophy underneath it, that fear could be met with patience instead of force, that trust once broken could always be rebuilt, given enough time and enough honest effort. The stone wall on the northern edge of the property, once a symbol of everything Nathan feared he'd never overcome, had become instead something of a landmark for the whole operation. Visitors and students alike made a point of walking out to see it, to hear the story of the ride that had saved the ranch, and more than a few young trainers working through their own difficult cases had taken to bringing their most challenging horses out to that wall for a final test, a way of honoring the moment that had proven once and for all that no fear was too deeply rooted to eventually be overcome. On a warm evening in early summer, 3 years to the day since Abigail had first walked through Nathan's gate, the two of them stood together at that same wall, watching their children. Twin boys not yet 2 years old, chasing each other through the grass under Mrs. Whitcomb's watchful eye, while Titan grazed peacefully nearby his coat, catching the last gold light of the setting sun. 3 years, Nathan said, watching his sons tumble through the grass with the easy joy of children who'd never known a single day of the hardship that had once threatened to swallow this entire ranch whole. Feels impossible sometimes looking back at where we started. Feels inevitable looking at where we ended up. Abigail said, leaning into him, watching Titan lift his great head to track the boy's movement with the same protective attention he'd shown every creature on this ranch since the day he'd finally learned that trust properly earned was worth extending. "You ever regret it?" Nathan asked. "Walking through that gate that day with nothing but $11 and your father's rope." Abigail considered the question seriously, the way she considered every question Nathan asked her, weighing it against 3 years of hardship and triumph both. "I regret that my father never got to see any of this. Never got to see the school built in his name. Never got to see how far his methods have traveled, how many horses and how many people they've reached beyond just the two of us." Her voice caught slightly, though the grief 3 years distant now had settled into something gentler than the raw wound it had once been. "But regret walking through that gate? Never. Not for one single moment. Losing him is what brought me here, and everything that grew from that loss, you are sons, this whole life we've built together. I think he'd be proud of every piece of it, even the parts that came from grief." "He'd be more than proud," Nathan said. "He'd probably say something wise and simple about how the hardest losses plant the deepest roots or some such thing, and he'd be right. Same as he seems to have been right about everything else you learned from him." They stood together a while longer, watching their sons play, watching Titan graze peacefully in the golden evening light, watching the stone wall that had once represented 4 years of failure and fear, now standing simply as a marker of everything they'd overcome together. A rancher who'd nearly lost everything, a grieving woman who'd walked in with nothing, a horse broken by trauma and rebuilt through patience, and a whole community freed from decades of quiet corruption because one person had refused to accept that broken things had to stay broken forever. The Carter School of Horsemanship continues to this day, training not just horses, but the men and women who work with them, teaching a philosophy that spread from one desperate month in Redstone, Wyoming, outward across an entire territory, and beyond the simple, unshakable truth that no creature, human or animal, is ever truly beyond saving, so long as someone is willing to offer patience instead of force, understanding instead of judgment, and time enough to let trust rebuild itself one honest day at a time. Titan lived to the ripe old age of 26, siring dozens of foals across his lifetime, each one carrying forward not just his powerful bloodline, but the gentle temperament Abigail had coaxed back into him during that first impossible month. And when he finally passed peacefully in the same pasture where he'd once terrorized 12 trainers before finding the one person patient enough to reach him, the entire county turned out to mourn a horse who had, in his own remarkable way, taught an entire generation the difference between breaking a spirit and healing one. Some walls exist only until someone chooses to cross them, and some hearts stay broken only until someone patient enough comes along to prove they were never beyond repair, and that more than any fortune saved or fraud exposed, remains the truest legacy of Red Hawk Ranch, standing still today, as a testament to what becomes possible when compassion outlasts cruelty, and when one grieving stranger's quiet courage proves strong enough to save not just a horse, not just a ranch, but an entire way of understanding what it truly means to trust again.